There is a country that existed twice. Once, it was ancient, a civilization that gave the world its roads, its laws, its language, the very shape of how empires are built and how they fall. The second time, it was a footnote, a peninsula caught between competing catastrophes, a place where the sun still fell golden on olive groves and hilltop churches, even as the ground beneath them was being contested, meter by meter, in some of the most ferocious fighting the Second World War would produce. Italy, in the years between 1943 and 1945, was not simply a theatre of war. It was a wound that refused to close. And at the heart of that wound, not Allied bombs, not partisan rifles, not even the grinding machinery of conventional German army divisions, stood a force that the world was still learning to understand, and that history has never quite finished arguing about: the Waffen-SS, Hitler's ideological soldiers, the men who were told, and who largely believed, that they were something more than an army, a vanguard, a shield, an iron wall planted in the soft earth of a country that had already surrendered, fighting on its soil anyway, because someone in Berlin had decided that Italy mattered too much to let go. This is their story, all of it, from the first tentative formations assembled in the chaos that followed Mussolini's fall, to the final, ragged retreats toward the Alps in the closing weeks of 1945, from the frozen ridgelines above Monte Cassino to the partisan-haunted valleys of the north, from the moment Germany's greatest ally became Germany's most complicated problem, to the moment the last SS officers either faced justice or quietly disappeared into a world that was already forgetting what they had done. It is a story of military professionalism and ideological brutality existing side by side, sometimes in the same man, sometimes in the same hour. It is a story of logistics and starvation, of tactical brilliance and strategic futility, of an occupation that began with calculated efficiency and ended in something approaching madness. And it is the story of Italy itself, a country occupied not once but twice within a generation, ground down between fascism and foreign control, and forced, in the war's aftermath, to decide what it actually believed about who it had been. This documentary covers 18 chapters. That is intentional. There is no shortcut through this material. The Waffen-SS in Italy is not a single battle, not a single atrocity, not a single charismatic officer or famous last stand. It is a complete operational history, the rise, the entrenchment, the slow collapse, and the long shadow that followed. Some of what you will hear tonight is well known to students of the Second World War. Much of it is not. The supply crisis that quietly destroyed German combat effectiveness before any Allied offensive could. The foreign contingents, men from countries thousands of kilometers away, fighting under an SS banner in Italian mountain snow, whose stories have almost entirely vanished from the popular record. The precise mechanics of how an occupation hardens, step by step, from military control into something darker. We have not invented names, dates, or numbers in this script. Where the record is clear, we have been precise. Where the record grows thin, we have followed the established shape of events, without papering over the gaps with fiction. That is a discipline worth naming, because this subject, the Waffen-SS in any context, has attracted more than its share of both sensationalism and deliberate distortion over the decades. Some writers have glorified these formations beyond recognition. Others have reduced them to a single, undifferentiated symbol of evil, stripping away the operational complexity that actually explains how they were able to fight for so long, in such difficult conditions, against such overwhelming material disadvantage. Neither approach serves the truth. Neither approach serves you. What we have tried to do, across all 18 chapters of tonight's program, is hold both things at once: the military reality and the moral one, the tactical competence and the crimes, the exhausted soldiers and the ideology that put them there and kept them there and, in some cases, drove them to acts that courts of law would later classify as war crimes. History is not a simple subject, and the Waffen-SS in Italy is not a simple chapter within it, but it is a chapter that deserves to be read in full, without flinching and without exaggeration. Now, before we begin, if this is the kind of content you want more of, if long-form, carefully researched military history told with patience and depth is what you come here for, then take a moment right now and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells us that this work matters to you. We cover the full sweep of the Second World War, the operational decisions that shaped it, the human stories buried inside the official records, and the aftermath that most documentary series reach but never quite finish. There is a great deal more to come, and we want you to be there for it. For those of you who are settling in tonight, find your position, get comfortable. The next several hours are going to take you from the dusty, sun-cracked failures of Italian military ambition in the 1930s, through the shocked corridors of power in Rome on the night the armistice was signed, through the cold mountain air of the Gothic Line in the winter of 1944 to 1945, and all the way to the final, unresolved reckoning that Italy is, in many ways, still conducting with itself. The narration is measured. There are no sudden bursts of dramatic music, no shock cuts, no cheap tension. This is history told the way history deserves to be told, steadily, with respect for complexity, at a pace that lets you actually absorb what you are hearing. Many people find this format ideal for sleep. The mind stays engaged just enough to follow the story, while the body lets go. If that is how tonight works for you, that is entirely by design, and it is entirely welcome. But whether you are watching with your full attention, or letting this wash over you in the dark, the story is the same, and it is a story worth knowing. Italy, 1943, an alliance breaking apart at the seams, a dictator fallen, and then risen again as a puppet, a peninsula about to become one of the most bitterly contested stretches of ground in the entire European war, and arriving into that chaos, with their distinctive collar insignia and their absolute conviction that they were the indispensable instrument of German will, the Waffen-SS. This is where we begin. There is a particular kind of pride that becomes its own undoing. It announces itself loudly, drapes itself in ceremony, and mistakes the roar of the crowd for the strength of the machine beneath. In the 1930s, Italy wore that pride like armor, polished on the outside, hollow within. Benito Mussolini had spent more than a decade constructing a vision of national greatness that was, in almost every measurable sense, more theater than substance. The trains, the rallies, the black-shirted marching columns, all of it pointed toward an empire reborn, a Roman inheritance reclaimed. But empires require iron and fuel and factories working at full capacity through the night. What Italy had, in truth, was theatre, and theatre, however spectacular, does not hold a line. Mussolini had come to power in 1922 on a wave of post-war bitterness. Italy had fought on the winning side in the First World War and had emerged from the peace settlement feeling cheated, diminished, denied the territorial rewards it had been promised. That wound never fully closed. It became the emotional engine of Italian fascism, a grievance dressed as destiny, a hunger for recognition that Mussolini fed and stoked with extraordinary political cunning. He was not stupid. He understood spectacle, he understood fear, and he understood the human need to believe in something larger than oneself. What he did not fully understand, or perhaps chose not to confront, was the gap between the Italy he described in his speeches and the Italy that actually existed in the workshops, barracks, and shipyards of the peninsula. That gap would eventually swallow everything. By the early 1930s, Mussolini had set his sights on East Africa. The Kingdom of Italy already held colonial footholds in Eritrea and Somalia, but Ethiopia, independent, ancient, and unconquered, represented something more symbolic. Its defeat would be, in Mussolini's framing, revenge for the humiliation at Adwa in 1896, where Italian forces had been routed by an African army in one of the most remarkable colonial defeats of the modern era. The invasion of Ethiopia began in October of 1935. It was, by any conventional military measure, a success. Italian forces, equipped with artillery, aircraft, and chemical weapons against an enemy that lacked any comparable means, eventually overwhelmed Ethiopian resistance. By May of 1936, Mussolini could stand on a balcony in Rome and declare the birth of the Italian Empire. The crowd roared, the facade gleamed, but the operation had required an enormous expenditure of men, materiel, and international goodwill, all of which Italy could ill afford to spend. The League of Nations responded with economic sanctions. Britain and France condemned the invasion with varying degrees of conviction, and in that moment of international isolation, Italy turned toward Germany, toward the one major European power that did not judge, did not sanction, and in fact found in Mussolini's defiance a useful precedent for its own ambitions. Adolf Hitler had watched the Italian leader with a complicated mixture of admiration and calculation. In the early years, Hitler had looked to Mussolini as a model, a pioneer of fascist governance who had achieved power first and blazed a trail. By the mid-1930s, the dynamic was quietly reversing. Germany was rearming at a pace that left Italy far behind, its industrial base expanding, its military modernizing, at a rate Mussolini's economic structure simply could not match. The two men who would bind their nations together in alliance were, even then, moving on fundamentally unequal terms. Albania fell to Italian forces in April of 1939, a swift military action against a small and essentially defenseless Balkan state that added another notch to the imperial bedpost, without adding any real strategic depth to Italy's position. It was the kind of victory that looks impressive in a headline and means very little on a map drawn by serious military planners. Italian forces encountered minimal resistance, and the operation was completed in a matter of days. Mussolini was pleased. His generals were pleased. Few paused to ask what the seizure of Albania actually revealed: that Italian military success depended heavily on opponents who could not fight back. The hard question, the one that would demand an honest answer within a few years, was how Italian forces would perform against an enemy that could. The honest answer, for anyone willing to look, was already visible in the structural realities of the Italian armed forces. Italy's army entered the late 1930s, equipped largely with weapons and doctrine inherited from the previous war. Artillery pieces that had been modern in 1917 were still in active service. Tank development had proceeded along lines that emphasized light, fast vehicles suited to colonial policing rather than armored warfare against a European peer. The Fiat and Ansaldo designs that formed the backbone of Italian armor were thinly protected, lightly armed, and mechanically unreliable under sustained operational stress. The infantry divisions were large on paper and often under strength in practice. Supply and logistics, the invisible architecture that determines whether an army can actually fight, were chronically underfunded. Training was inconsistent. Officer quality varied enormously between the elite formations and the bulk of the line divisions. None of this was secret. Italian military planners knew it, wrote about it, and submitted reports that made the problems plain. Those reports rarely produced the reforms they recommended. The Italian industrial economy was the fundamental constraint that no political will could simply override. Italy lacked significant domestic coal deposits and was almost entirely dependent on imported oil. Steel production lagged far behind Germany, Britain, or France. The northern industrial triangle of Milan, Turin, and Genoa produced cars, textiles, and consumer goods with genuine efficiency, but the conversion of that capacity to war production was slow, expensive, and never fully achieved. Mussolini's autarky policies, the drive for economic self-sufficiency, produced more propaganda than results. Italy remained dangerously dependent on external supply for the basic materials of modern warfare. In a prolonged conflict against a coalition with naval superiority, that dependency would become a sentence. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, Mussolini did something that surprised almost everyone who knew him. He stayed out. Italy declared itself non-belligerent, a status that acknowledged the country was not neutral in sympathy, but was not ready to fight. It was, in its way, an admission. The Pact of Steel, signed with Germany only months earlier, had committed Italy to military cooperation, and yet Mussolini could not follow through. His military chiefs told him the truth plainly. Italy was not prepared for a major war. Not in 1939, possibly not for several years. The stocks of ammunition were inadequate. The fuel reserves were critically low. The army needed re-equipment on a scale that Italian industry could not currently deliver. Mussolini absorbed this humiliation privately and presented it publicly as strategic patience. He was waiting for the right moment, he said. He was choosing his hour. That hour came, or seemed to come, in June of 1940. France was collapsing under the weight of Germany's advance. The Wehrmacht had done in 6 weeks what 4 years of the First World War had failed to accomplish. Mussolini, watching the maps, made his calculation. The war was almost over. Germany had already won, and Italy must enter now or be left out of the peace settlement entirely. On the 10th of June 1940, Italy declared war on France and Britain. The timing was, by any measure, opportunistic. The French were already broken, and the fighting along Italy's Alpine border was brief and inconclusive. France signed its armistice before Italian forces made any significant territorial gain. Italy had entered a collapsing house and called it conquest. What followed was a string of military disasters that stripped away the remaining credibility of Italian arms. The offensive in North Africa, initially successful in pushing east from Libya into Egypt, stalled and then reversed catastrophically. British and Commonwealth forces under General Wavell shattered the Italian 10th Army in a campaign of extraordinary efficiency between December of 1940 and February of 1941. More than 100,000 Italian prisoners were taken. The Greek campaign, launched in October of 1940, without German knowledge or consent, ended in Italian humiliation. Greek forces drove the attackers back into Albania and held them there through the winter. Germany was forced to intervene in both theaters to prevent Axis collapse, committing resources and attention that Hitler had not budgeted for and could not easily spare. Each German intervention carried a price, not in treasure, though the cost was real enough. The price was strategic authority. Every time German forces arrived to rescue Italian operations, in North Africa, in the Balkans, along the Mediterranean, the balance of the alliance tilted further. Italy was no longer a partner in any meaningful operational sense. It was a theatre requiring management, a liability dressed in fascist uniform. Mussolini's personal authority, which had rested on the mythology of martial effectiveness, was quietly eroding with each communiqué that requested German support. The two nations were bound together now, not by shared strength, but by mutual necessity. And by 1940, the necessity was far more Italy's than Germany's. The Italian peninsula, that German planners were now studying with increasing seriousness, was a country of genuine beauty and genuine fragility. Its geography, mountain spines, river valleys, narrow coastal plains, would one day make it a defender's paradise. But in 1940 and 1941, it was a country whose armies were losing, whose factories were struggling, and whose leader was spinning an ever more elaborate fiction about the nature of the war he had chosen to join. The stage was already being set for a German military presence that would begin as support, deepen into partnership, and eventually become something closer to occupation. What that presence would look like, and what it would cost the peninsula and its people, was still a few years away. But the architecture of dependence had already been drawn. There is a particular kind of silence that falls when an alliance dies. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of suspended breath. The moment before a machine, with too many broken parts, finally tears itself apart. In the summer of 1943, that silence settled over Rome like heat haze, and beneath it, the most consequential political betrayal of the entire Italian war was already in motion. For 3 years, Benito Mussolini had walked beside Adolf Hitler as a partner, however unequal, however strained. By July of that year, the walking had stopped. What followed was not simply the fall of one man. It was the unraveling of an entire strategic fiction. The idea that Italy could remain a willing participant in a war it was losing, at every level, on every front, in every city where the bombers came. The structure had been cracking for years. The disasters in North Africa, the repeated humiliations in Greece, the catastrophic losses in the Soviet Union, where entire Italian armies had been shredded by the winter, and the Red Army's counteroffensives. All of it had hollowed out whatever genuine conviction remained inside the Italian military establishment. Soldiers were poorly equipped, underfed, and increasingly aware that the war was not being fought for Italy's interests. Officers who had once believed in the fascist program found themselves commanding men with worn-out boots and rifles that jammed in the cold. The industrial base could not keep pace with the demands of a modern mechanized war, and the gap between German capability and Italian capability had grown so wide that the alliance had become, in practice, a dependency. Italy was not Germany's partner, it was Germany's burden. When Allied forces landed in Sicily in July of 1943, the final thread snapped. The invasion, executed by American and British forces under combined command, met resistance, but moved with a momentum that Italian and German defenders could not ultimately reverse. Within weeks, the island was slipping away. Inside Rome, the men around Mussolini, many of them senior fascist figures who had served him for decades, began to calculate their own survival with cold clarity. On the 25th of July, 1943, the Grand Council of Fascism voted against Mussolini in a session that lasted through the night. By morning, the Duce, who had ruled Italy for more than 20 years, was arrested on the orders of King Victor Emmanuel III and driven away in an ambulance, under guard, to a destination his captors were careful to keep changing so that German rescue attempts would be frustrated. Hitler received the news with a rage that those present described as extraordinary, even by his standards. His immediate instinct was intervention, not simply because of loyalty to Mussolini, though that played a role, but because he understood with perfect strategic clarity what an Italian capitulation would mean. The southern flank of Fortress Europe would be open. Allied air bases would appear on the Italian peninsula. The road to Austria, to southern Germany, to the industrial heartland of the Reich itself, would be shorter and more navigable than it had ever been. While German diplomats and intelligence officers sent reassuring messages to Rome in the days following Mussolini's arrest, messages designed to keep the new government of Marshal Pietro Badoglio from moving immediately toward the Allies, German military planners were already working in the opposite direction. The reinforcement of German forces in Italy began quietly, methodically, in the hours after Mussolini fell. Badoglio's government spent the following 6 weeks performing a diplomatic balancing act that satisfied no one and deceived everyone. Publicly, Rome declared that the war would continue. Privately, Italian representatives were making contact with Allied emissaries, feeling their way toward a separate peace with extraordinary caution, aware that any premature disclosure would bring the German army crashing down on them before the Allies could offer any protection. The negotiations that unfolded across those weeks were complex, sometimes farcical, and ultimately shaped by a brutal arithmetic. The Allies were in a stronger position every day, and the Germans knew the Italians were talking. German intelligence had fragmentary but significant information about the armistice discussions. The reinforcements kept flowing south across the Brenner Pass and through the Alpine tunnels. German divisions that had been held in northern Italy or stationed near the major cities were repositioned with the quiet efficiency of a force that was not planning to leave. The armistice itself was signed on the 3rd of September, 1943, in a military tent in Sicily. It was announced publicly 5 days later, on the 8th of September, broadcast to the Italian people by radio in the early evening. The announcement was coordinated, poorly, as it turned out, with Allied landings at Salerno, where American and British forces came ashore on the 9th, hoping that Italian resistance would have already collapsed in the chaos. What they encountered instead was something their planners had underestimated. Not Italian resistance, which had in fact largely dissolved, but German resistance, which had not. The Germans had used every hour of the preceding weeks to prepare exactly for this moment. Operation Axis, the German plan for the military occupation of Italy, had been rehearsed, refined, and pre-positioned. When the armistice announcement went out over the radio, it was the signal the Germans had been waiting for. What happened in the next 72 hours was one of the most rapid and complete military transformations of the entire European war. German units across the Italian peninsula moved simultaneously against their former allies. Italian soldiers who had been fighting alongside German formations found themselves surrounded, disarmed at gunpoint, and in many cases, stripped of their weapons and vehicles within hours of the announcement. The Italian army, which had never been restructured or re-equipped or psychologically prepared for this moment, simply came apart. Most units received no orders from Rome. The government had evacuated. King Victor Emmanuel, Badoglio, and the senior military staff fled south by road in the early morning hours, abandoning the capital without issuing a coherent directive to the millions of Italian soldiers now scattered across Italy, the Balkans, and the Greek islands. Those men were left to make individual decisions in the absence of any command, and most of them made the only decision available. They stopped fighting. The Germans moved on Rome itself, with divisions that had already been staged nearby. Street fighting was brief and unequal. Resistance at the city gates cost Italian lives without changing the outcome. By the 11th of September, German forces controlled the Italian capital. The swastika flew above buildings that had, just weeks before, been the institutional heart of a sovereign ally. It was not a conquest in the conventional sense. No declaration of war, no formal siege, no extended campaign. It was something colder and more surgical, the replacement of one kind of authority with another, executed before the replaced authority could organize any coherent response. Across the country, the same pattern repeated itself with local variations. German garrisons expanded. Italian weapons were collected and catalogued. Italian officers who resisted the disarmament were dealt with by whatever means German commanders judged appropriate. The scale of the Italian military collapse created a problem that would define German occupation policy for the remainder of the war. More than 600,000 Italian soldiers were eventually captured, disarmed, and transported to Germany and German-occupied territories as labor, reclassified not as prisoners of war, but as military internees, a category invented specifically to deny them the protections that international convention would otherwise have required. These men worked in German factories, on German farms, and at German construction sites. They lived under conditions that varied enormously, but were often brutal. For the soldiers still in the Balkans, and in Greece, and on the Aegean Islands, the disarmament was in some cases resisted, and those resistances ended with the summary execution of entire garrisons. The Italian armed forces that had existed that morning ceased to exist by nightfall. What replaced them, in the occupied territories, was German military authority, undisguised and total. Hitler's formal instrument for governing occupied Italy was the Italian Social Republic, but that structure required weeks to assemble. In the immediate aftermath of September, what mattered was military reality, and military reality in Italy in the autumn of 1943 meant German divisions and, increasingly, German SS formations. The Waffen-SS had a specific and expanding role in the occupation that differed from that of the regular Wehrmacht, where Wehrmacht commanders were primarily concerned with holding the front against Allied advances from the south. SS formations were directed toward the internal security of occupied territory, the suppression of dissent, the management of the population, the hunting of partisans whose networks were already beginning to form in the mountains and cities of the north and center. The occupation had barely begun, and already it was hardening into something more than a military administration. The Italian population absorbed the German occupation with a complex mixture of shock, resignation, and suppressed fury. For many Italians, the Germans had been, until the previous month, allies, even friends in some cases, soldiers who had drunk wine in Italian taverns and traded cigarettes with Italian infantrymen at the front. Now those same soldiers were on the streets with weapons pointed inward, at the population itself. The transition from ally to occupier required no formal declaration, no ceremony, no diplomatic note. It was made manifest simply by the presence of German rifles, aimed at Italian faces. Families were split, communities were disrupted. The economy, already battered by 3 years of war, lurched toward collapse as German requisitioning took food, livestock, vehicles, and raw materials at a pace and scale that normal Italian economic life could not absorb. Resistance did not spring up immediately everywhere, but the conditions for it were being laid down in real time. The strategic picture that emerged from the events of that September would shape every subsequent chapter of the Italian campaign. The Allies had hoped that Italian capitulation would hand them the peninsula quickly, that the German forces already present would be isolated, outmaneuvered, or compelled to withdraw. Instead, the opposite happened. The swift and total German military response transformed Italy from a contested ally into a fully occupied territory, and transformed the Allied advance from a potential sprint into what would become the most grinding, attritional, and costly campaign in the Western European theatre. The mountains were German, the cities were German, the supply routes, the rail lines, the river crossings, all of it now fell under the authority of a German military command that was methodical, experienced, and deeply motivated to hold every meter of Italian soil for as long as possible. Italy, the country that had tried to exit the war quietly and on its own terms, now found itself at the center of it. In the weeks following Italy's armistice, the German military machine moved with a speed and precision that left almost no room for Italian hesitation. Divisions that had once marched alongside their Italian allies now swept through the peninsula as an occupying force, seizing ports, rail junctions, and mountain passes before Rome could fully process what had happened. The Wehrmacht and the SS did not arrive as partners any longer. They arrived as owners, and with that shift in relationship came an immediate practical question, one that every occupation force eventually confronts. How do you hold a country with armies already stretched thin across a continent on fire? The answer, as Berlin saw it, was not simply to pour more German blood into Italian soil. The answer was to find Italians willing to pour their own. The search for those Italians began almost simultaneously with the occupation itself. SS commanders understood, as they had understood in France, in the Low Countries, and across Eastern Europe, that a conquered population contains within it a subset of men who will fight for the conqueror. Some do so out of genuine ideological conviction. Others act from opportunism, or from fear, or from a grudge against neighbors who had never given them their due. It did not particularly matter which motivation drove a recruit through the door, as long as he arrived. In the autumn of 1943, recruitment offices opened across northern Italy and in Rome's occupied districts, staffed by German SS officers and Italian intermediaries who understood the local social terrain. Posters appeared on walls. Fascist newspapers carried appeals. Word spread through the remnants of Italy's military infrastructure, reaching soldiers who had watched their own chain of command dissolve overnight and were now looking for somewhere to belong. The 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division would become the most significant German SS formation assembled from Italian soil, and its construction was a study in the peculiar arithmetic of occupation-era military manpower. At its core were German SS cadre troops, experienced men drawn from other divisions, tasked with providing the institutional knowledge, the doctrinal framework, and the disciplinary spine around which an Italian unit could be built. Around that German core, Italian volunteers began to accumulate. They came from the fascist youth organizations, from the remnants of Mussolini's regular army, and from the ideologically committed fringe that had always believed in the Axis partnership more completely than most of their countrymen. These were men who did not interpret the armistice as liberation. They interpreted it as betrayal, and that sense of betrayal, channeled carefully, produced soldiers with something to prove. What the recruitment drives could not always produce in sufficient numbers, conscription supplemented. Across occupied northern Italy, young men of military age found themselves facing a stark set of options. They could volunteer for one of the German or Italian fascist formations. They could attempt to disappear into the countryside and risk the dangers of that choice. Or they could simply be pressed into service with little ceremony and less explanation. The distinction between volunteer and conscript was, in practice, often a matter of paperwork rather than reality. Men who appeared on the rolls of the 16th SS as volunteers had sometimes been presented with the decision in circumstances that made refusal a dangerous proposition. The SS was not a patient institution, and the logistics of occupation did not encourage prolonged deliberation. Training camps were established at various points across northern Italy and, for some units, across the German-speaking territories to the north. The quality of training varied considerably, depending on the time available and the pressure already building on the front lines in the south. Some recruits went through a compressed version of standard SS preparation: physical conditioning, weapons familiarization, unit cohesion drills, and the particular brand of ideological reinforcement that the SS imposed on all its formations regardless of nationality. Others received the absolute minimum before being attached to operational units that needed bodies now and would finish their education in the field. German cadre officers complained, in reports that traveled up through the command structure, about the difficulties of producing combat-ready soldiers from men who had only recently been fighting under a different flag, or in some cases, no flag at all. Language presented a friction that no amount of organizational efficiency could fully smooth away. Orders passed through layers of translation. A German SS officer would give a command in German. An Italian liaison would render it into something his men could understand, with all the losses and distortions that interpretation entails under stress. In the controlled environment of a training camp, this was inconvenient. In the middle of a firefight, it could be catastrophic. German commanders recognized the problem early and pushed to embed more bilingual personnel throughout the division's structure, but fluent German-Italian speakers were not a resource the Reich possessed in abundance. The result was a chain of command that functioned adequately in stable conditions and cracked under sudden pressure in ways that purely German formations did not. The 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division took its full designation from the name attached to it by Berlin, a name that carried ideological freight, connecting it to the broader SS identity, even as its membership was predominantly non-German. Alongside this division, smaller SS-affiliated formations took shape across the peninsula, drawing on different pools of manpower and serving different specific functions. Some were oriented primarily towards security and anti-partisan operations, rather than frontline combat. Others were assembled to guard rail lines, bridges, and supply depots, the unglamorous but absolutely critical infrastructure of an occupation. The boundaries between these roles were rarely as clean in practice as they appeared in organizational charts. A unit assigned to rail security one week might find itself attached to a combat formation the next, as the situation along the shifting front demanded. The relationship between these newly formed SS units and the parallel Italian fascist military organizations that were simultaneously taking shape under Mussolini's reconstituted government was never straightforward. On paper, the two existed as allied forces with complementary functions. In practice, German SS commanders held the real authority, and Italian fascist officers frequently found themselves subordinated in ways that the official documents did not quite acknowledge. German officers questioned the combat reliability of their Italian counterparts, sometimes with justification, and sometimes as a reflex of the same condescension that had characterized the German view of Italian military capacity throughout the alliance. Italian officers, for their part, resented the assumption that their formations existed primarily as auxiliaries to German ambitions. These tensions did not prevent operational cooperation, but they produced a working relationship built on mutual wariness rather than genuine partnership. The deployment of Waffen-SS units across the Italian peninsula followed the logic of an army simultaneously fighting a frontline war and administering an occupation, two demands that pull against each other in almost every practical respect. Frontline combat consumes the best trained, best equipped troops in the most physically demanding role imaginable. Occupation administration requires persistent presence spread across a wide geographic area, with enough force visible in enough places to suppress resistance and maintain the appearance of control. The SS in Italy was being asked to do both at once, with formations that were still consolidating their own identities and command structures. The strain showed almost immediately. By the end of 1943, Waffen-SS elements were already being fed into the defensive positions, taking shape in central Italy, arriving in some cases before their training had been completed and before the administrative apparatus of their parent divisions had finished being assembled. Junior officers leading Italian recruits into the winter line's outer positions sometimes commanded men they had known for only a matter of weeks. The soldiers they led into those defensive lines knew the terrain, or at least knew Italy in a way their German officers did not. But the cohesion that turns a group of armed men into a unit capable of holding ground under sustained pressure requires time and shared experience that these formations had barely begun to accumulate. The decision to use Waffen-SS branding for these Italian recruited formations was not accidental or purely administrative. The SS carried with it a reputation, deliberately constructed over years, for ferocity, discipline, and ideological commitment that regular Wehrmacht formations did not project to quite the same degree. Attaching that identity to newly formed Italian units was an attempt to transfer the reputation along with the insignia. Whether Italian recruits genuinely absorbed the ideological content of SS indoctrination, or whether they simply wore the uniform because it came with rations and a wage, varied enormously from man to man and unit to unit. What is clear is that the formations that emerged from this process carried the institutional expectations of their parent organization into every action they took, and those expectations would shape their conduct throughout the Italian campaign in ways that would be remembered long after the war itself had ended. What had been assembled by the close of 1943 was imperfect, incomplete, and under enormous pressure from multiple directions at once. It was also, by the standards of what the German war machine was capable of producing at that point in the conflict, a genuine achievement of organizational improvisation. The 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division and its associated formations had been summoned from chaos in a matter of months, pressed into a strategic role that exceeded their experience, and pointed southward toward an Allied advance that showed no intention of pausing to allow them to get ready. The men who filled their ranks, German and Italian, volunteer and conscript, convinced fascist and reluctant participant, would spend the next year and a half learning what they were made of in the hardest possible classroom. The mountains and valleys of Italy would be their instructor, and the lessons would cost a great deal. On the 12th of September, 1943, a small fleet of German gliders swept silently down toward a remote mountain plateau in the central Apennines. Their target was a hotel, the Campo Imperatore, perched high above the tree line on the Gran Sasso Massif. Inside, held under armed guard and stripped of every symbol of the power he had once wielded with such theatrical flair, sat Benito Mussolini. He had been arrested by order of King Victor Emmanuel III, barely 2 months earlier, hustled away in an ambulance, and shuttled between locations as his former allies scrambled to keep him from German reach. The rescue that followed was swift, precise, and almost bloodless. Within minutes, the commandos had secured the building, Mussolini had been escorted to a waiting aircraft, and the operation was effectively complete. Hitler had retrieved his most prized political asset, not because he needed a partner, but because he needed a symbol. The man who had once styled himself the elder statesman of European fascism now owed his continued existence entirely to the regime he had spent a decade trying to court as an equal. What followed was not a restoration. It was a construction, Deliberate, controlled, and almost entirely German in design. Within days of his rescue, Mussolini was transported north to German-occupied territory and installed as the head of a new Italian state, formally announced on the 23rd of September, 1943. Its name drew from a small town on the western shore of Lake Garda, Salo. The Italian Social Republic, as the new entity styled itself, occupied a strip of northern Italy that German forces already controlled in all but name. Mussolini gave speeches, signed decrees, and received delegations. He issued proclamations that rang with the old cadences of fascist rhetoric, promising a return to the revolutionary spirit of 1919, a purging of the monarchical and bourgeois corruption that had, in his telling, betrayed the movement. But behind every ministry, every military formation, and every policy directive, German oversight was immediate and total. The Waffen-SS was not merely present at the founding of this state. In practical terms, it was its guarantor. The German command structure that oversaw the Italian Social Republic was layered and deliberately opaque. At the top sat the higher SS and police leader for Italy, a position that concentrated both security and military authority within SS hands. Below that, regional commanders and unit commanders divided the peninsula into zones of responsibility that overlapped imperfectly with Mussolini's nominal government ministries. The SS did not announce this dominance in public. It was simply built into the architecture of power. When Mussolini's ministers sought to arrest a partisan suspect, they needed German approval. When the Italian Social Republic attempted to raise revenue or commandeer industrial output, German economic officers held final say. The result was a government that functioned more as a stage set than an administration, populated by genuine fascist believers who had not surrendered their idealism, but stripped of the independent authority that genuine governance required. Mussolini understood this. His private correspondence from the Salo period is suffused with a bitterness he rarely expressed in public, a recognition that he was, as he put it, to at least one confidant, no longer a head of state, but a prisoner with a title. Yet within this constrained architecture, the Italian Social Republic did attempt to build a genuine military machine. The effort was driven partly by ideological conviction. The hardcore fascists who had stayed loyal through the crisis of 1943 genuinely believed in the cause, and partly by German pressure. Berlin needed Italian manpower to hold down occupied territory, guard supply lines, conduct anti-partisan sweeps, and free German formations for frontline duty. The Waffen-SS took a direct role in shaping several of these Italian formations, embedding German cadre as advisors, instructors, and in some cases, effective commanders. The results were uneven at best. Some Italian fascist units, recruited from volunteers with genuine ideological commitment, developed into capable formations that operated effectively alongside their German counterparts. Others were plagued by desertions, poor equipment, inadequate training, and the grinding awareness among their men that the Italy they were fighting for existed largely on paper. The most significant of the Italian Social Republic's military formations was the National Republican Army, assembled through a combination of volunteers, the coercive redrafting of former Italian army personnel, and transfers from the various fascist militia organizations that had survived the September crisis. The Waffen-SS worked alongside this force in a relationship that was never entirely comfortable. German SS officers tended to view their Italian counterparts with a mixture of professional condescension and pragmatic acknowledgement that they needed every available body. Italian fascist commanders, for their part, often resented the assumption embedded in German oversight. the presumption that Italian units required German supervision to function at all. These tensions were managed rather than resolved, suppressed by the shared imperatives of occupation and combat. When operations went well, credit flowed freely in both directions. When they went badly, blame settled unevenly, and the fault lines between the two allies became briefly, uncomfortably visible. The coordination between SS formations and Italian fascist units was most intensive in the anti-partisan sphere, and it is here that the character of the collaboration reveals itself most clearly. Northern Italy, in the autumn and winter of 1943, was not a pacified zone. Partisan networks had begun forming almost immediately after the armistice, drawing on former Italian army soldiers who had scattered rather than surrender to German disarmament, on communists and socialists who had spent years waiting for exactly this moment, and on ordinary Italians whose politics were far less defined, but whose tolerance for occupation had its limits. The Waffen-SS, with its established doctrine of counterinsurgency drawn from operations on the Eastern Front, brought a particular ruthlessness to the suppression of these networks. Italian fascist units, many of them operating in their own home regions against neighbors, and in some cases former friends and relatives, brought a different quality to the violence, one sharpened by personal grievance, factional scores, and the particular savagery that civil conflict generates. The command arrangements for joint operations were formalized through a series of agreements between SS headquarters and the Italian Social Republic's Interior Ministry, but formalization did not mean clarity. In practice, SS units conducting sweeps or cordon operations in a given area might call on Italian fascist militias for support, or might operate in parallel without meaningful coordination. The Italian forces brought local knowledge and language capability that German SS formations simply could not replicate. The SS brought firepower, transport, and the authority that came with being the genuine power in the territory. Neither element could substitute for the other entirely, and the hybrid nature of these operations meant that accountability for what happened during them was diffused across two distinct chains of command, a diffusion that would matter enormously when the reckoning finally came. The Lake Garda region, where Mussolini maintained his government's nominal seat, became the symbolic and administrative heart of this collaboration. German SS security units maintained a permanent presence around the lakeside villas and requisitioned hotels that housed the Republic's ministries. The atmosphere was simultaneously surreal and oppressive. Fascist officials conducting government business, a short walk from the SS officers, who held genuine authority over the territory. Mussolini received German visitors with the formal courtesies of a head of state, while knowing, and they knowing, that the courtesy was essentially theatrical. His cabinet ministers issued communiques in the name of Italian sovereignty, while SS checkpoints controlled the roads outside their windows. The lake's beauty, its clean water, its cypress-lined shores, its winter light, provided an incongruous backdrop to the mechanics of puppet governance. The political dimension of the Italian Social Republic's collaboration with the Waffen-SS deserves particular attention because it was not conducted entirely under duress. A significant core of Italian fascism's true believers saw in the Republic's foundation a chance to return to what they regarded as the movement's uncorrupted origins, to strip away the monarchy, the conservatives, the opportunists who had surrounded Mussolini in Rome, and rebuild fascism on a purer, more radical base. The Verona Congress of November 1943 produced a manifesto that incorporated elements of social radicalism alongside the predictable nationalist and anti-Semitic provisions. and some of its architects genuinely believed they were constructing something new. For these men, collaboration with the SS was not degradation but alliance, a joining of forces with the movement that had, in their reading, remained true where Italian fascism had wavered. This ideological affinity made some Italian fascist units more reliable partners for the SS than their German commanders might have expected, and it deepened the entanglement between the two structures in ways that went beyond mere operational coordination. The anti-Jewish measures implemented under the Italian Social Republic represent one of the clearest expressions of this entanglement. Italy had enacted racial legislation in 1938, but enforcement had been uneven, and the machinery of persecution had never achieved the systematic character it held elsewhere. After the Republic's founding, that changed. The Italian Social Republic's interior police, operating with SS guidance and in some operations, direct SS participation, began the systematic registration and arrest of Jewish Italians in the occupied territories. The roundups that followed claimed thousands of lives, with victims transported northward through German-controlled transit points toward the extermination infrastructure of the East. SS officers coordinated the logistics. Italian fascist officials provided administrative support, and in some cases, led operations themselves. This was not purely German policy, imposed on reluctant Italian partners. Elements of the collaboration were genuinely shared, which is precisely what made them so devastating and so difficult for Italian collective memory to process in the decades that followed. By the end of 1943, the Italian Social Republic had settled into its contradictory existence with a grim kind of permanence. It was a state whose sovereignty was entirely contingent on German military power, whose population ranged from committed supporters to sullen acquiescence to active resistance, and whose security apparatus was increasingly defined by its joint operations with the Waffen-SS. For the German formations that would spend the next 18 months fighting the Allies to the south and suppressing partisans at their backs, the Republic was a resource, human, logistical, and political. For the Italian fascists who staffed it and served under its flag, it was both a belief system and a trap, a cause that bound them to a losing alliance, in a country that was already, in its quiet corners and mountain villages, beginning to organize against them both. The mountains of central Italy do not forgive. They rise from the valley floors in broken ridgelines and sheer limestone faces, channeling every road, every advance, every retreat into corridors that can be held by a fraction of the men it takes to attack them. When German engineers and Waffen-SS combat planners surveyed this ground in the autumn of 1943, they understood immediately what the terrain was offering them. The Allied armies pressing northward from Sicily and the toe of the boot would have to come through passes they could not go around, across rivers that ran cold and fast, up slopes where artillery could not follow and air power lost its edge. The mountains, in other words, were doing half the work. All that remained was to fill them with steel and men willing to die in place. The line the Germans constructed across central Italy that autumn was not a single barrier, but a series of interlocking defensive positions, each one designed to bleed attackers and buy time for the one behind it. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, proved himself among the most capable defensive strategists of the entire war. He understood that Italy could not be held forever, but he also understood that every week gained in the south was a week of breathing room for the Reich elsewhere. The Waffen-SS formations arriving in the theatre were folded into this larger logic. They were not there to win Italy. They were there to make its loss as slow and expensive as possible. The distinction mattered. It shaped everything that followed. from the disposition of troops along mountain ridgelines to the psychology of men who fought knowing they were buying time rather than seizing ground. The winter line itself ran in a rough arc across the width of the peninsula, anchored in the west on the Tyrrhenian coast and in the east on the Adriatic. Its backbone was a chain of fortified positions exploiting the natural geography of the valleys of the Repetido, the Garigliano, and the surrounding heights. Engineers had worked through the early autumn blasting positions into rock, laying wire across ravines, zeroing artillery onto every approach route that Allied commanders might choose. By late 1943, the defensive works had reached a maturity that startled Allied reconnaissance officers studying aerial photographs. What they were looking at was not improvised. It was engineered with a thoroughness that spoke to months of preparation and to Kesselring's conviction that the Allies could be stopped here for a very long time. The Waffen-SS units deployed along and behind the winter line arrived in stages, absorbing their assigned sectors and learning the ground with the practiced efficiency of formations that had already fought in Russia and the Balkans. The terrain was unlike anything most of them had encountered before. The Eastern Front offered vastness, room to maneuver, depth in which a broken unit could fall back and reconstitute. Italy offered none of that. Here the front was narrow, every position overlooked by another, every move observed by enemy spotters on the ridges above. A soldier posted to a mountain strongpoint could see the next Allied position with the naked eye. The war contracted to something intensely personal and claustrophobically close. Veterans who had endured the open steppe found the Italian winter confining in a way that operated on the nerves differently from anything they had known. Supply was the first serious problem. Mules replaced trucks on the upper slopes. Ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and water had all to be carried by hand or by animal up tracks that became rivers of mud when the autumn rains arrived. The rains came early and stayed late, turning the valleys into bogs and the roads into obstacles. Allied air power, increasingly dominant over the peninsula, made daylight movement on the main roads dangerous enough that most resupply happened at night, in convoy, under strict blackout conditions. SS logistics officers who had stretched supply lines across the steppes of Ukraine found Italy's compressed geography a different kind of problem, not a matter of distance, but of exposure. Every kilometer of road was watched. Every convoy was a potential target. The pressure this placed on quartermaster staffs was relentless and cumulative. The first serious Allied probing attacks against the winter line began arriving before the fortifications were fully complete. American and British forces, advancing along separate axes, tested the German positions with increasing determination through November and into December of 1943. What they encountered was not passive defense. The Waffen-SS sectors responded to probes with immediate counterattacks, pushing Allied infantry back from gains before they could be consolidated. This was doctrine, drilled into SS formations from their earliest training. Ground yielded was ground that had to be retaken at greater cost. Better to counterattack while the enemy was still disorganized from his own advance than to wait until he had dug in and called up his reserves. In Italy, this instinct produced a grinding back and forth across frozen hillsides that wore on both sides with brutal efficiency. American forces pressing along the western corridor discovered very quickly that the men holding the high ground across from them were not going to be dislodged by a single sharp push. Units that had been told the German defenses were thinly manned found themselves engaged by well-positioned machine guns, covering interlocking fields of fire, by mortar crews who had pre-registered their weapons on every obvious line of approach, and by artillery that responded to Allied concentrations with a speed that suggested the battery commanders had their maps very well prepared. The Americans learned, they always learned, but the learning had a cost, paid in casualties that accumulated through the short grey days of an Italian winter when the cloud ceiling dropped too low for air support and the infantry were on their own with their rifles and their courage. British formations pushing in the east found conditions no less demanding. The Adriatic sector offered slightly different ground, lower ridges, broader valleys, but the German defensive philosophy was identical. Hold the high features, channel the attackers into the bottoms where they could be observed and engaged from three sides. Use the rivers as obstacles and the near slopes as killing grounds. Waffen-SS and regular Wehrmacht units rotated through sectors, maintaining pressure and familiarity with the ground. The distinction between SS and army formations, significant at the command level and in terms of equipment priority, was less visible to the Allied infantry, who were simply trying to get through. From the bottom of a ravine, looking up at a fortified position, on a crest 300 meters above, the badge on the collar of the man shooting at you was not the primary concern. The human cost on both sides accumulated quietly through the winter months. There were no single catastrophic engagements, no battles that produced a clean narrative of attack and defense and outcome. Instead, there was accumulation, patrols that went out and did not come back, positions that changed hands and were retaken, night raids that achieved local surprise and then dissolved back into the dark. Frostbite and trench foot claimed men who had survived the fighting. The Italian winter at altitude was not dramatically cold by Russian standards, but it was persistently, penetratingly damp, and dampness combined with static positions and inadequate footwear did what enemy fire sometimes could not. Medical officers in SS formations reported sick lists that grew steadily through January of 1944, composed not of dramatic wounds, but of accumulated attrition. What the Winter Line revealed, for those with eyes to see it clearly, was a structural truth about the campaign in Italy that would remain constant until the very end. The Germans could defend. Kesselring's genius, the Waffen-SS's discipline, the Wehrmacht's engineering expertise, all of it combined to make the defensive problem extraordinarily difficult for the Allies to solve. But defending was not winning. Every week spent on the Winter Line was a week in which the broader strategic balance shifted further against the Reich. Reinforcements that flowed into SS units in Italy were reinforcements not available on the Eastern Front, where the weight of Soviet offensives was beginning to be felt, with an insistence that no defensive brilliance could entirely answer. The Winter Line was a masterpiece of tactical management applied to an ultimately losing position. The soldiers holding it did not necessarily see the larger picture with clarity. What they saw was their sector, their ridge, their river crossing. They saw the men to their left and right, in positions they had helped dig and improve. They saw the Allied artillery fire that crept closer each time the enemy adjusted his range cards, and they felt the particular exhaustion of men who sleep lightly because they must, who eat when they can rather than when scheduled, who measure time not in days, but in the interval between the last contact and the next. For the Waffen-SS formations, working through their first sustained Italian campaign, the Winter Line was an education that could not be replicated in training. It taught them that this theatre would offer no quick resolutions, no enveloping maneuvers, no dramatic armored breakthroughs. It would offer only the slow, grinding, costly business of holding ground against men who were determined to take it, and doing that week after week, until something, somewhere else, broke first. And something would. In January of 1944, Allied commanders made a decision that threatened to render the entire winter line irrelevant at a stroke. Ships were already assembling in the harbors to the south. The sea offered what the mountains had denied, a way around. The Anzio landings were coming, and with them, a crisis that would test the Waffen-SS in Italy, in ways the mountain winter had only begun to suggest. There is a ridge in central Italy where the stone itself seems to remember. It rises from the valley floor in great broken shelves of limestone, grey and pale as ash, commanding every road, every river crossing, every approach that any army moving northward must eventually face. The Liri Valley stretches below it, wide and open and lethal, offering no cover, no mercy, no path forward that does not pass beneath the gaze of whoever holds the heights. And in the winter of 1944, the men who held those heights were dug in deep, hardened by months of defensive warfare, and determined to yield nothing. The ancient Benedictine monastery that crowned the summit of Monte Cassino had stood for more than 14 centuries. It had survived plague, earthquake, and the collapse of empires. Now, it would become the focal point of one of the most brutal and sustained battles the Western Allied campaign in Europe had yet produced. For the German defenders, and for the Waffen-SS formations rotated through its approaches, Monte Cassino was not merely a position, it was a statement of intent. The strategic logic was as brutal as it was clear. Control of the heights around Cassino meant control of Route 6, the ancient Via Casalina, the road that led through the valley and onward to Rome. Allied commanders understood this perfectly, which is precisely why they threw formation after formation against the German defenses through the first months of the year. American infantry, French colonial troops, Indian and New Zealand divisions, each came in turn, each fought with extraordinary courage, and each was stopped. The German defensive network here was not improvised. It had been constructed with methodical care, exploiting every natural advantage the terrain offered, every fold in the ground, every outcropping of rock that could shelter a machine gun or a forward observer. The Waffen-SS units operating in and around the Cassino sector inherited a system that rewarded patience and punished aggression, and they adapted to it with the grim efficiency that had come to define their approach to defensive warfare on the Italian front. The first major Allied assault against the Winter Line positions around Cassino began in January of 1944, and the fighting that followed dismantled any lingering Allied optimism about a swift advance to Rome. The Rapido River crossing, attempted by American forces in bitter cold and under heavy fire, collapsed with catastrophic losses. Units that reached the far bank found themselves cut off, without support, unable to move forward or retreat. The river that looked narrow on a map became an impossible obstacle under the weight of German defensive fire. The SS formations positioned to support the broader defensive network around the valley contributed to that weight, their observers calling down artillery and mortar fire with precision that spoke of well-prepared positions and months of accumulated knowledge of the ground. For the Allied soldiers in the valley below, the sensation was of fighting not just men, but the landscape itself. The monastery presented a particular agony for Allied commanders. Its thick medieval walls and commanding position made it, from a purely military standpoint, an almost perfect observation post. German forces consistently denied that the building itself was being used for military purposes, and the historical record on this question remains genuinely contested. But to the Allied soldiers pinned in the valley, looking up at those pale walls silhouetted against the winter sky, the distinction felt academic. The psychological weight of the place was enormous. A structure that had endured since the 6th century seemed to embody the permanence and impregnability of the defense itself. When Allied commanders eventually ordered the monastery bombed in February of 1944, the resulting destruction shocked observers around the world. The ruins, paradoxically, became even more defensible than the intact building had been, offering rubble fields and shattered walls that German paratroopers and supporting SS elements transformed into a labyrinth of interlocking fighting positions. Through February and into March, the assaults continued and the defenders held. New Zealand and Indian forces fought through the town of Cassino itself, a fight conducted almost entirely at close range, among the ruins of buildings that had already been hammered flat by artillery and bombing. Every cellar was a potential strongpoint. Every rubble pile concealed a sniper or a forward observer. The Waffen-SS personnel operating through this sector did not experience Monte Cassino as a single battle, but as an unbroken succession of engagements, each one costly, each one demanding the same grinding expenditure of men and ammunition. Casualties among the defenders were severe and unrelenting. Replacements arrived in numbers that never quite matched the losses. The men who held these positions understood, at some level, that they were being consumed, along with the ground they were ordered to protect. The supply situation for the defenders on the heights bordered on the extraordinary in its difficulty. Moving anything, food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, up the slopes of Monte Cassino required movement under observation and under fire. Mule teams operated at night, when the risk was marginally lower, but even darkness offered no guarantee of safety. Allied artillery had registered the approach routes with precision, and harassment fire fell, without predictable pattern, at all hours. German and SS soldiers at the forward positions sometimes went without hot food for days at a stretch. Water was rationed. The wounded had to be evacuated along the same exposed paths that supplies came up, carried by hand when the terrain made any other method impossible. The physical endurance required simply to exist in these positions, quite apart from the demand to fight effectively, represented a sustained test that few military formations in history have been asked to pass for as long as the defenders of Monte Cassino were asked to pass it. The third Allied assault on Cassino, launched in mid-March of 1944, was preceded by one of the most concentrated aerial and artillery bombardments of the Italian campaign. More than 400 aircraft dropped hundreds of tons of bombs on the town below the monastery, reducing what remained of Cassino to a moonscape of craters and dust. Allied commanders believed that nothing could survive such an onslaught. They were wrong. When the New Zealand and Indian infantry moved forward into the smoke and the settling dust, they found German paratroopers and SS-attached elements emerging from dugouts and reinforced cellars, shaken but combat effective, ready to contest every meter of what remained. The bombardment had destroyed the town as a habitable place, but had simultaneously created the perfect defensive terrain, broken, irregular, offering cover everywhere and clear fields of fire nowhere. There is something in the record of these months at Cassino that resists easy summary. The Allied forces attacking the position were not failing through lack of courage or commitment. The Free French forces that fought in the mountains to the north of the main line displayed extraordinary skill and determination. The Indian and Gurkha troops who climbed the heights in darkness and fought at close quarters on the rocky ground above the monastery performed feats of arms that were recognized even by the defenders who faced them. The failure to break through was not a failure of the men. It was a collision between the offensive will of Allied armies and the near-perfect suitability of the terrain and the prepared defensive system for the men who held it. The Waffen-SS formations that contributed to that defense did not create this situation. They inhabited it, sustained it at enormous cost, and added their own discipline and tactical experience to a line that for 4 months refused to break. It was not until mid-May of 1944 that the line finally gave way, and it gave way not where the defenders expected. The fourth and final Allied assault on the Cassino position was part of a much broader offensive along the entire front, a coordinated push that stretched German reserves to their limit and beyond. French Expeditionary Corps forces, including Moroccan mountain troops, found a path through the Urunzi Mountains to the south that had been considered impassable and exploited it with devastating effect. The flanking movement unhinged the position that 4 months of frontal assault had failed to crack. When the breakthrough came, it came fast, and the German defenders of Monte Cassino found themselves at risk of encirclement. The withdrawal from positions held at such extraordinary cost, through such extraordinary suffering, was ordered and executed with the discipline that had characterized the defense throughout. The monastery itself, when Allied troops finally reached it, was a ruin. The bombing of February had done its work on the ancient walls. What remained was a skeleton of stone, dust-covered and open to the sky, its library and its art reduced to rubble. The symbolic weight of its destruction would become a source of controversy that outlasted the war by decades. A question about what military necessity actually demands and what it cannot justify. For the men who had fought in its shadow for 4 months, such questions were perhaps secondary to the simpler arithmetic of survival. The German and SS casualties at Monte Cassino were severe. The Allied casualties were catastrophic. Both sides had paid a price that measured not in equipment or ground, but in the particular irreversible currency of soldiers killed and maimed on one of the most contested pieces of terrain the Second World War produced. What Monte Cassino demonstrated, and what Allied commanders would carry forward into the rest of the Italian campaign, was the fundamental difficulty of dislodging a prepared, determined, skilled defensive force from terrain that favored the defender at every point. The Waffen-SS divisions and supporting formations that rotated through the Cassino sector during those 4 months did not win the battle in any final sense. No defender wins a battle that ultimately ends in withdrawal. But they exacted a cost that reshaped the Allied timeline for Italy and consumed resources and momentum that Allied commanders had hoped to apply elsewhere. The mountains of central Italy had made an army of them, patient and hard, and stripped of any illusions about what this campaign would require. Further north, beyond the valleys they had held for so long, the Gothic Line was being prepared, and the same logic, stone and height and defensive depth, was being applied on an even larger scale. The soldiers who survived Monte Cassino knew exactly what that meant. While German divisions fought the Allies along the Winter Line, a different war was already unfolding in the shadows of the Italian countryside. Partisans, armed civilians, escaped soldiers, and resistance fighters moved through forests and mountain villages, striking at occupation forces and supply lines. For the Waffen-SS, this hidden enemy would prove as dangerous and consuming as any Allied battalion. The partisan movement was not a unified military force with clear command structures or battlefield formations. Instead, it was a network of autonomous cells operating across occupied Italy, loosely coordinated by communist organizers, monarchist factions, and anti-fascist groups with competing political visions. What united them was a single purpose: to make German and Italian fascist control as costly and difficult as possible. By late 1943, months before the Allies even reached the Gothic Line, partisan activity was already forcing German commanders to divert precious troops away from frontline duty to conduct security sweeps and protect supply routes. This meant that for every soldier committed to anti-partisan operations, one fewer soldier was available to hold defensive positions against the Allies. The partisans understood this mathematics perfectly, and they exploited it relentlessly. The Waffen-SS took the partisan threat with utmost seriousness, treating resistance cells not as soldiers, but as terrorists and criminals deserving swift elimination. SS commanders saw the partisan war as a test of ideological commitment and tactical flexibility, a chance to demonstrate the superiority of German security doctrine against what they dismissed as disorganized rabble. Yet this contempt for the partisan movement masked a growing anxiety within German command. Partisan attacks on isolated patrols, ammunition convoys, and supply depots increased steadily through 1944. German officers reported that their lines of communication were becoming increasingly vulnerable, that soldiers were reluctant to travel roads after dark, and that rear areas could no longer be considered safe. The partisan movement had grown from scattered resistance cells into a genuine military force, capable of coordinated operations. In some areas of central and northern Italy, entire regions had become de facto partisan territory, with German control extending only as far as the nearest military garrison. This situation forced the SS to adapt their strategy and deploy counterinsurgency formations, specifically tasked with suppressing the resistance. The Waffen-SS response to partisan activity was systematic and ruthless. SS commanders understood that a counterinsurgency campaign requires not just military force, but also the elimination of the social and logistical infrastructure that sustains resistance. Partisan fighters needed food, shelter, medical care, and intelligence, resources that typically came from sympathetic civilians in the villages and countryside where they operated. The SS strategy was therefore twofold: destroy the partisan military capability through direct combat operations, and sever the connection between partisans and their civilian support base through intimidation and collective punishment. SS formations began conducting sweeps through suspected partisan territory, cordoning off villages, and searching houses for weapons, ammunition, and evidence of collaboration. These operations were not police actions or routine security patrols. They were military campaigns designed to eliminate an enemy and instill fear in the civilian population. When partisans were discovered, they were typically shot on the spot, rather than captured and interrogated. When villages were found to contain partisan supplies or to have harbored resistance fighters, reprisals followed. The mechanics of reprisal operations became the defining feature of SS occupation policy in Italy. When partisans attacked a German convoy or killed SS soldiers, German command would identify a nearby village suspected of partisan sympathy and order immediate retribution. The reprisals followed a predictable pattern. Soldiers would surround the village, arrest suspected partisan sympathizers, or simply arbitrary groups of civilians, and execute them publicly. In some cases, entire villages were burned to discourage future resistance. These actions were not spontaneous acts of rage by individual soldiers. They were coordinated operations ordered by SS command as deliberate policy. The intent was to create such a high cost for civilian support of partisans that the population would withdraw that support. In reality, the effect was the opposite. Each reprisal created new partisans from families that had lost relatives, deepening the cycle of violence and widening the gulf between the occupation forces and the Italian population. SS commanders were aware of this dynamic, but pursued the strategy anyway, believing that greater force and terror would eventually suppress resistance entirely. The partisan war became a brutal counterinsurgency campaign that claimed thousands of lives, most of them Italian civilians. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of people died in the partisan struggle and its aftermath, some in direct combat between partisans and German or Italian fascist forces, many more in reprisals, massacres, and the general violence of occupation. The Waffen-SS units, deployed to counterinsurgency duty, included some of the most ideologically committed and militarily experienced formations available to German command. These were not rear area security troops or poorly trained garrison forces. They were combat divisions temporarily diverted from the front to conduct what Nazi doctrine called cleansing operations. The 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division, the 29th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division, and other formations spent significant portions of 1944 engaged in anti-partisan sweeps across the Apennines and the Tuscany region. These were elite combat units with modern weapons and professional officer corps, deployed against fighters armed with rifles, explosives, and determination. The disparity in resources and training was enormous, yet the partisans persisted. What made the partisan war impossible for the SS to decisively win was its nature as a political conflict disguised as a military one. Partisans operated in territory where much of the civilian population either actively supported the resistance or at minimum did not oppose it. This support was rooted not in military calculation, but in political conviction, anger at fascism, resentment of German occupation, and belief in a democratic and independent Italy. The partisans could therefore regenerate their forces continuously by recruiting from the local population, replacing losses with new fighters who emerged from villages and farms. For the SS, killing one partisan merely created the possibility that 5 new partisans would emerge in that partisan's family or village. The mathematics of counterinsurgency worked against German interests. As 1944 progressed, SS commanders reported with increasing frustration that anti-partisan operations were consuming ever greater resources while producing no permanent reduction in partisan capability. Supply lines remained vulnerable. Isolated posts continued to be attacked, and the German rear area remained contested territory despite constant sweeps and reprisals. The partisan war also created constant friction between German military command and SS leadership over the appropriate response to resistance activity. Regular Wehrmacht officers, focused on holding the front line against the Allies, viewed anti-partisan operations as a distraction from the primary military mission. They argued that resources deployed to counterinsurgency could better be used in frontline fortifications and defense. SS commanders, by contrast, viewed the partisan threat as integral to overall security in occupied territories and believed that suppressing resistance was fundamental to maintaining occupation control. These disagreements were rarely resolved cleanly. Instead, SS units often conducted operations independently or with only loose coordination with Wehrmacht formations. This duplication of effort and confusion of command actually made anti-partisan campaigns less effective while still consuming substantial German resources. The result was a grinding stalemate in which neither the partisans nor the SS could decisively defeat the other, but the partisans maintained the strategic advantage of operating in terrain and among a population sympathetic to their cause. The experience of conducting counterinsurgency warfare transformed the Waffen-SS in Italy during 1944. Soldiers and officers who had trained for conventional warfare against military opponents now found themselves hunting civilians through mountains and villages. The moral clarity of conventional combat, soldier versus soldier, uniforms versus uniforms, disappeared in the partisan war. SS troops frequently could not distinguish combatants from civilians, which made every operation fraught with tension and the constant possibility of violence. Some SS units developed reputations for particular brutality in anti-partisan operations, earning names among resistance fighters as especially dangerous and cruel. Others maintained stricter discipline and attempted to distinguish between actual partisans and civilian bystanders, though this restraint was exceptional rather than the norm. What all SS units shared was the conviction that they were engaged in a civilizational struggle against subhuman enemies who did not deserve standard military treatment. This ideological framework, instilled through constant Nazi indoctrination, made it easier for SS soldiers to commit acts that would have seemed unthinkable in conventional warfare. By the middle of 1944, the partisan war had thoroughly penetrated the consciousness of SS units operating in Italy. Intelligence officers reported on partisan cell structures and recruitment patterns. Supply officers calculated the cost of protecting convoys and maintaining secure lines of communication. Medical personnel treated soldiers wounded in partisan ambushes. Frontline commanders factored partisan threats into operational planning, recognizing that the enemy was not only in front of them, but also behind them, in the territory they supposedly controlled. The partisans had succeeded in making themselves impossible to ignore. German command estimates consistently underestimated partisan strength and capability, partly because they refused to recognize partisans as legitimate combatants, and partly because partisan forces genuinely grew faster than German intelligence could track. By late 1944, partisan armies, numbered in the tens of thousands across occupied Italy, organized into regional commands and capable of conducting coordinated operations spanning multiple villages and supply routes. The SS units tasked with suppressing this movement found themselves in a battle they could not win through military force alone, yet continued to apply military solutions anyway. The partisan war also exposed the fundamental contradiction in German occupation strategy. The Nazi regime claimed to be a civilizing force, bringing order and stability to territories under German control. Yet the occupation of Italy was maintained through terror, reprisal, and collective punishment, policies that guaranteed continued resistance and violated basic principles of military law and human decency. German officers knew this. Commanders who had studied military history understood that counterinsurgency campaigns fail when they lose legitimacy with the civilian population and become seen as purely oppressive. Yet the Nazi regime offered no alternative approach. Negotiation and political compromise were ideologically impossible, and restraint was seen as weakness. The only response authorized by Berlin was greater force, more thorough security operations, and more severe reprisals. This created a vicious cycle in which German brutality generated resistance. Resistance required brutality to suppress, and the requirement for brutality created more resistance. The SS became trapped in this cycle, increasingly aware of its futility, but unable to escape the ideological framework that demanded total annihilation of the enemy. The partisan war in occupied Italy also revealed tensions within the Waffen-SS itself regarding identity and purpose. The organization had been founded as an elite combat force, the ideological spearhead of National Socialism. Waffen-SS soldiers took pride in their military effectiveness and their fidelity to Nazi principles. Yet anti-partisan operations in Italy required them to act as occupiers, police, and executioners, roles that felt degrading to soldiers who saw themselves as warriors. Some SS personnel, particularly younger officers fresh from ideology training, embraced these duties as expressions of ideological commitment and saw partisan suppression as a sacred duty. Others, particularly older officers with conventional military backgrounds, resented the diversion of combat troops to security duties, and viewed anti-partisan operations as tedious garrison work, unworthy of elite formations. These tensions never erupted into open conflict, but they created an undercurrent of resentment and moral confusion within SS units. Young soldiers were told they were superior beings fighting subhuman enemies, yet they found themselves carrying out mass executions against civilians, who sometimes included women and children. The cognitive dissonance between Nazi ideology and occupation reality never fully resolved. As 1944 drew to a close, the partisan war remained unresolved and was actually intensifying. News of Germany's desperate situation on other fronts, the Soviet advance from the east, the American and British progress in Western Europe, reached Italian partisans through underground networks and radio broadcasts. This news strengthened rather than weakened partisan resolve, because they understood that German defeat was inevitable. Why negotiate or surrender when time was working in their favor? The SS, conversely, found themselves fighting an enemy that was growing in confidence and capability, while German resources were increasingly diverted to other theaters. The German commanders responsible for Italy began to realize that the peninsula was becoming a secondary theater in a war that was being decided elsewhere. Yet the partisan problem remained, demanding constant attention and resources. The hidden war behind the lines would continue until the final German collapse, claiming lives and consuming resources to the very end. Neither side could achieve total victory in this particular conflict. The partisans could not drive the Germans out, and the SS could not eliminate the resistance. What remained was grinding attrition, cycles of violence and retribution, and the steady erosion of German control in occupied territories, as the broader war turned decisively against Nazi Germany. The winter of 1943 turned bitter on the Italian peninsula. German forces held the Winter Line, a jagged fortification running across the mountainous spine of central Italy, and Allied commanders faced a strategic impasse. The mountains were steep, the supply lines were long, winter slowed everything. But in Rome, at the headquarters of the Allied command, a bold idea was taking shape. If the enemy could not be broken head-on through the mountains, perhaps he could be surprised from behind. On the 22nd of January 1944, Operation Shingle began. American and British forces, some 50,000 troops in the first wave, descended from transport ships and landing craft onto the beaches near Anzio, some 50 kilometers south of Rome. The landing itself met minimal resistance. Surprise had worked. For a brief moment, the Germans were caught off guard, and the Allies held the initiative. But that moment would not last long. The German response was immediate and methodical. Hitler's orders crackled through the command structure. The beachhead must be contained, then crushed, then erased. No retreat, no negotiation. The Allies would be pushed back into the sea, their supplies cut, their reinforcements turned away. General John Lucas, commanding the American forces at Anzio, chose caution. Rather than immediately breaking out inland and pushing toward Rome, he decided to consolidate the beachhead, unload supplies, and establish a secure perimeter. It was a reasonable commander's choice, given the risks of overextension, but it gave the Germans time, and time was what the Germans needed. Within hours, German divisions began moving toward Anzio from every direction. Infantry formations marched from the north. Tank units disengaged from the Winter Line and raced southward, and from their barracks and assembly areas across occupied Italy, the Waffen-SS divisions began their mobilization. The 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division received orders to move immediately. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, commanded by experienced SS officers, began coordinating the containment effort. The Waffen-SS would form the cutting edge of the German response. The challenge would consume their strength and resources for months to come. The beachhead itself became a symbol of German defensive reflex. Anzio was not a city of grand strategic value. It was a coastal town with a small port facility and no particular historic significance. But once the Allies landed, it became a scar on the German line that had to be removed. German commanders established a semicircular defensive perimeter around the beachhead, stretching roughly 15 kilometers from the coast. Infantry divisions dug in along the high ground overlooking the beaches. Artillery batteries were positioned to rake any attempt at breakout. Panzer reserves were held ready to attack concentrations of American armor. The SS divisions occupied some of the most critical defensive sectors, particularly along the northern edge of the perimeter, where any American thrust toward Rome would first encounter German armor. The 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division, still incomplete and hastily formed from German SS cadre and Italian volunteers, took up positions north of the beachhead. Other SS formations stretched along the line. The Germans began a strategy of constant attrition. They would not allow the Allies to rest. They would attack whenever the opportunity appeared. They would trade ground defensively only when absolutely necessary, making the Allies fight for every kilometer. The first major German counterattack came in late January. SS Panzergrenadier units, supported by tanks and assault guns, drove against the American positions on the beachhead's eastern flank. The assault had shock and intensity. German soldiers knew this was their chance to push an invading force back into the sea, something that had not been accomplished in months. The propaganda value alone was enormous, but the American forces dug in and fought back. Artillery support from naval guns offshore provided devastating fire support that no German unit in Italy had yet encountered with such consistency. The counterattack stalled. German losses mounted. The SS divisions committed again and again throughout February and March, each time hoping to break through. Each time the Allies held. The grinding nature of the fighting began to exhaust the German forces. Replacement troops were limited. Supply trucks struggling against Allied air superiority brought less ammunition and fuel with each passing week. The SS units that had arrived at Anzio as fighting formations began to be worn down by attrition, not by spectacular defeats, but by the slow bleeding of daily combat. General Lucas faced enormous pressure from his superiors to break out and move inland, but the German defensive perimeter held firm. Every American attempt to advance was met with coordinated German resistance. SS tank units would counterattack. Infantry would hold terrain stubbornly. Artillery concentrations would be brought to bear. The Germans demonstrated real tactical skill at Anzio. They understood how to defend terrain, how to mass fires, how to coordinate infantry and armor. The problem was that they lacked the resources to sustain their defense indefinitely. As February turned to March, the fighting on the Anzio beachhead became a symbol of something larger in the German military situation. The Germans could still fight well tactically. German commanders were still making smart decisions. German soldiers still demonstrated courage and discipline. But below the surface, the foundations were cracking. The 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division and other SS formations could not be sustained in the Italian theater forever. Germany was fighting a two-front war that was draining manpower and resources at a rate that could never be replenished. Every German division tied down at Anzio was a division that could not be sent to France or the Eastern Front. Every tank lost at Anzio was a tank that the German defense industry could not replace quickly enough. By early April, the Germans launched what they hoped would be the decisive blow against the Anzio beachhead. The operation, codenamed Aktion Dietrich by the Germans, involved a coordinated assault by SS Panzergrenadier divisions, and regular army infantry formations against the American positions. The attack was set for the 6th of April. SS units mustered their remaining armor and concentrated their forces for what they believed would be the breakthrough that would shatter the Anzio bridgehead. But the Allies had broken German radio codes. They knew the attack was coming. They prepared their defenses. They massed their artillery. When the German assault began, it ran into a wall of fire. Concentrated American artillery barrages caught German units in assembly areas. Tank killer teams decimated German armor as it advanced across exposed ground. The SS Panzer Grenadiers fought with their characteristic ferocity, but the weight of American firepower was simply overwhelming. By nightfall, the German offensive had failed. The casualty lists were grim. More than 5,000 German soldiers were killed or wounded in a single day of fighting. The SS divisions had suffered losses they could not afford. Still, German command orders remained unchanged. Hold the beachhead, do not allow breakout. The Waffen-SS would continue the struggle. Through April and into May, the fighting at Anzio continued with a kind of brutal monotony. The beachhead was never quiet. Artillery fire was constant. Patrols and small unit actions occurred almost nightly. The Americans, however, were receiving fresh supplies, fresh troops, and fresh ammunition. The Germans received far less. German field hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties. German cemeteries on the outskirts of Anzio grew steadily. Desertion began to whisper through some units, though the Waffen-SS maintained strict discipline and would shoot soldiers attempting to flee. The SS divisions at Anzio lived in trenches and foxholes, constantly cold, often wet, perpetually hungry, and aware with each passing week that the war was not going Germany's way. Rumors from the wider front trickled down. Italy was lost. France would be invaded soon. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Why? The soldiers asked quietly among themselves. Were they dying for a beachhead in a country that Hitler no longer truly controlled? Such doubts were dangerous. Officers stamped them out, but they existed, growing slowly in the minds of young men who could see the future clearly. The breakthrough came in late May. By then, the Anzio beachhead had received substantial reinforcements. The Allies launched Operation Diadem, a coordinated assault along the entire winter line, designed to break through and link up with the Anzio force. The winter line finally fractured under sustained assault. German forces began retreating northward. General Lucas's American divisions at Anzio seized the moment and drove northeast toward the German positions. The encirclement that German commanders had feared was now possible. German forces at Anzio faced the choice between holding the beachhead and being surrounded, or withdrawing northward to escape the trap. German command authorized withdrawal. The 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division and other SS units began their retreat from the beachhead, covered by rearguard actions and coordinated delaying tactics. The withdrawal itself was executed competently. German units fell back in good order, maintaining tactical cohesion even as they retreated. But the illusion that Anzio could be pushed into the sea was now definitively shattered. The beachhead had cost the Germans dearly, tying down multiple divisions for months and inflicting irreplaceable losses. In exchange, the Allies had secured a foothold that could not be eliminated and had eventually broken through the German defensive line itself. The Anzio campaign revealed the fundamental tensions in the German strategic situation in Italy. The Waffen-SS divisions that fought there showed genuine tactical competence. Commanders made reasonable decisions given their circumstances. Soldiers fought with discipline and courage. The German defensive strategy, while ultimately unsuccessful, was neither stupid nor poorly executed. But the campaign also exposed the deeper problem that no amount of tactical skill could resolve. Germany was being pressed on every front simultaneously. Resources that could have been used to reinforce Italy were being held back for the expected Allied invasion of France, now known to be coming imminently. Manpower replacements were being diverted to other theatres. The industrial capacity to replace lost equipment was being overwhelmed by the scale of German losses. The Anzio beachhead became a symbol of this larger truth. The Germans could still defeat the Allies in individual engagements, but they could no longer prevent the Allies from breaking through, advancing, and ultimately defeating Germany itself. The Waffen-SS at Anzio had fought well, but no amount of fighting well could overcome the fact that Germany was fighting a war it could not win. By June, the situation in Italy had fundamentally changed. The Anzio beachhead had been successfully held and eventually expanded. The German winter line had been broken. Allied forces were racing toward Rome. The German command in Italy faced a new crisis. The defenses that had seemed so permanent, the defensive lines that had been so carefully fortified, were now collapsing in rapid succession. Waffen-SS divisions that had just finished the grueling Anzio campaign found themselves immediately engaged in new defensive battles as the Allies advanced northward. There would be no respite. There would be no consolidation of the beachhead defense and then preparation for the next phase. Instead, the entire German position in central Italy was unraveling. Partisan activity behind German lines was intensifying. Supply lines were under constant attack from Allied air forces. Manpower shortages were becoming critical. The illusion that Germany could hold Italy indefinitely had evaporated. The Anzio campaign, despite German tactical successes in individual battles, had been a strategic defeat of enormous proportions. The beachhead had been meant to be eliminated. It never was. The beachhead had been meant to be contained while Germany defeated the Allies elsewhere. But Germany was not defeating the Allies anywhere. The failure at Anzio crystallized the truth that German commanders had quietly known for months. War in Italy was being lost, not because the Waffen-SS could not fight, but because Germany no longer had the resources to win. In the winter months of 1943 and into the spring of 1944, the German military machine in Italy faced a problem that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. It was not the courage of their soldiers or the skill of their commanders that faltered. Rather, it was the slow, grinding collapse of the supply system that kept them alive and fighting. Trucks carrying ammunition and fuel moved along roads that had become shooting galleries. Railway lines that connected the ports of southern Italy to the German defensive lines in the north were constantly severed by Allied bombing raids. Every bridge, every depot, every supply route became a target for aircraft that owned the sky. The Waffen-SS divisions fighting in Italy discovered a truth that would pursue them across every theatre of the war. An army without supplies is merely a collection of armed men waiting to be defeated. The mathematics of Italian logistics were brutally straightforward. Germany controlled a peninsula that stretched nearly 750 kilometers from the Strait of Messina to the northern borders near Switzerland. The entire supply chain depended on a single artery, the Brenner Pass, the mountain passage that connected Italy to Austria and the German homeland beyond. Through this narrow corridor flowed everything the Wehrmacht and SS needed to maintain their position: ammunition, fuel, food, replacement troops, spare parts for vehicles and weapons. Every item had to travel across terrain that the Allies had already decided to contest, with every tool at their disposal. Photographs from 1944 show German supply depots half buried in rubble, vehicles twisted into metal sculptures by bomb fragments, and rail yards that resembled archaeological sites of destruction rather than functioning military infrastructure. The first signs of serious shortage appeared not in official reports, but in the margins of soldier letters and the careful language of unit war diaries. An SS Panzer Grenadier officer, writing in March 1944, noted that his division had begun rationing ammunition for training exercises. Tank crews practiced maneuvers without firing their guns to conserve shells. Anti-tank gunners sat beside weapons they dared not use, except in genuine emergency, knowing that replacement ammunition might not arrive for weeks or even months. The psychological weight of this imposed restraint was enormous. Soldiers trained for combat in the assumption they could fight back. Here, they had to make calculations about whether defending a position was worth expending shells that might be needed elsewhere. Rations shrank perceptibly month by month. What had been adequate food in 1943 became meager by 1944. Fuel shortages posed an equally devastating problem, perhaps more so than ammunition. German mechanized warfare depended entirely on reliable fuel supply. Panzer tanks consumed hundreds of liters per operational day. Supply trucks burned fuel, carrying other fuel across dangerous distances. Artillery pieces that might have been towed by horses in earlier eras now required trucks running on petrol. The Waffen-SS divisions in Italy found their mobility increasingly constrained, not by enemy action, but by empty tanks. Commanders who wanted to concentrate forces for a counterattack had to calculate whether the fuel cost of moving and fighting was worth the likely tactical gain. One division report from April 1944 stated that only 40% of armored vehicles were operational on any given day because fuel could not be allocated to maintain a higher strength. The irony was profound. The Germans had conquered half of Europe, partly through the terrifying speed and shock of mechanized warfare, and now those very machines were becoming liabilities because they consumed resources faster than logistics could replenish them. The Brenner Pass became the ultimate bottleneck, and both the Germans and the Allies understood its strategic importance perfectly. When good weather allowed, Allied bombers from airfields in southern Italy and North Africa attacked the pass relentlessly. On clear days, formations of American fighter bombers would appear at noon, rake the roads with machine gun fire, and vanish before German anti-aircraft defenses could be effective. German engineers worked constantly to repair damage, fill craters, and keep the road passable. But the cycle of destruction and repair accelerated throughout 1944. A railroad that paralleled the road suffered even more severely because locomotives could not hide or disperse the way trucks could. On a single day, in late April 1944, Allies bombers destroyed so many rail bridges and rail yards that German commanders estimated it would take 6 weeks to restore service. It took much longer. When service partially resumed, trains moved slowly and cautiously, and many never reached their destinations because they were attacked en route. The consequences manifested across every level of German military operations in Italy. Panzer divisions that should have had 60 or 70 functional tanks might maintain only 20. SS divisions ordered to hold critical defensive positions could not spare the fuel to rotate troops to rear areas for rest or to concentrate reserves for counterattacks. Artillery batteries that needed to fire thousands of rounds during major engagements had to limit themselves to a few hundred shots. The Wehrmacht and SS adapted with considerable ingenuity, but adaptation had limits. Horses returned to prominence in supply chains, creatures that required fodder but could move along paths that trucks could not traverse. Animals, however, moved slowly and could not carry enough supplies to sustain an army. Captured Italian equipment and vehicles, often worn out and unreliable, supplemented German stocks, but these machines broke down frequently and required parts that were not readily available. Officers rotated between acceptance and desperation in their response to shortage. At a certain psychological moment, usually following a failed counterattack or a lost engagement, commanders would submit reports that bordered on the pessimistic. A Wehrmacht general, commanding in the mountains, wrote in May 1944 that without major reinforcement of supplies, his position could be maintained for perhaps 3 more months before ammunition reserves became too depleted for defensive operations. Higher command, however, could not provide what the supply system could not deliver. The Brenner Pass was already functioning at its absolute maximum capacity. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts, in Russia, in France, in the Balkans, and across North Africa. Italy was rated as a secondary theatre in Hitler's strategic thinking, which meant it received the residue of available supplies after other theatres had taken what they needed. The Italian theatre was not being starved by deliberate choice from Berlin, so much as it was being undersupplied by the simple arithmetic of total war outrunning total resources. The Waffen-SS units in Italy pursued ruthlessness as a substitute for abundance. When supplies ran short, units intensified requisition from local Italian populations. Crops were seized, livestock confiscated, and stored food sources emptied. Italian civilians already suffering from poor harvests and disrupted trade found themselves stripped of what little they could grow or preserve. This ruthlessness kept German and SS soldiers fed in the short term, but turned Italian civilians increasingly hostile and sympathetic to partisan movements. A soldier who had stolen grain from a village's stores to feed himself fed an idea of resistance that would grow into the armed bands that harassed German supply columns. The dynamic was self-defeating in the longer term, but in the immediate moment, ruthlessness solved the shortage problem at the cost of security and stability. Tank crews learned to extract every possible kilometer from their fuel allocations. Drivers adopted techniques to conserve petrol, maintaining constant speed rather than accelerating, using engine braking downhill instead of burning fuel in the transmission, and idling engines only when absolutely necessary. These were minor savings, but when an entire army was adopting them, the accumulated result was meaningful. Mechanics became more important than they had ever been, because a vehicle kept operational for another week had not consumed replacement fuel that would have been needed to field a new machine. The entire approach to mechanized warfare subtly shifted from replacement philosophy to maintenance and repair philosophy. Instead of replacing broken tanks with new ones, crews struggled to keep their damaged machines functional. This was tactically inferior to fresh equipment, but made the best of impossible supply circumstances. Ammunition, unlike fuel, could not be rationed into non-existence, but only delayed. Artillery batteries that could not fire during peacetime months because shells were needed elsewhere made their selection of targets extraordinarily deliberate when they finally received ammunition. A single defensive position might receive a few hundred rounds of ammunition monthly instead of thousands. Gun crews had to calculate the probability of each shot hitting a valuable target, and had to be disciplined enough to hold fire against targets that could be ignored or allowed to pass unmolested. This required a different mentality from the typical artillery officer who wanted to deliver crushing firepower to overwhelm enemy positions. Instead, German gun crews became almost surgical in their approach. Identify the target that will produce maximum damage with minimum ammunition expenditure, fire those rounds, then go silent. Over a period of time, this discipline reduced overall firepower significantly. The Waffen-SS divisions that had arrived in Italy in 1943 with modern equipment and full supply allotments and found themselves by mid-1944 operating with aging tanks, cannibalized vehicles, and ammunition boxes that appeared less frequently than they had previously. Replacement troops arrived in smaller numbers and with less training because training facilities in Germany were overwhelmed by the demands of other theatres. Some divisions were rotated out of Italy to face the Allies in France after the invasion in June 1944, which actually relieved pressure on Italian supply lines by requiring fewer mouths to feed. Those divisions that remained in Italy faced the prospect of a long, grinding defensive war where survival depended more on careful management of diminishing resources than on bold offensive action. The great counterattacks and aggressive operations that had characterized earlier phases of the Italian campaign became increasingly difficult to mount, not because courage or competence was lacking, but because the fundamental materials of modern warfare were drying up. By autumn 1944, German commanders in Italy had reached an unspoken consensus. The peninsula could not be held indefinitely and would eventually have to be surrendered. The mathematics of logistics made this clear to officers who were not receiving the supplies they needed to replace losses or maintain equipment. They could slow the Allied advance significantly through defensive operations along prepared lines. They could make the conquest of Italy expensive in lives and time, but they could not expel the Allies or even permanently stabilize a front because the supply situation was not improving and showed no prospect of improvement. The tragedy of German warfare in Italy became the tragedy of a professional military forced to acknowledge that no amount of skill or courage could overcome the fundamental imbalance between available supplies and the demands of an army fighting a two-front war. The Waffen-SS divisions that fought across the Italian peninsula from 1943 to 1945 were not defeated primarily by Allied soldiers. They were defeated gradually, methodically, and almost inevitably by their own supply lines drying up. This was not the kind of defeat that appeared in dramatic moments, or that could be reversed by a sudden tactical success. It was the slow, inevitable defeat that comes when the machine itself, no matter how well maintained or courageously operated, simply runs out of fuel. By the spring of 1944, the German position in Italy had become a paradox of strength and fragility. On the map, the Wehrmacht still controlled nearly two-thirds of the peninsula, their defensive lines running across the narrowest parts of the Italian terrain, like a tourniquet designed to halt the Allied advance. Yet beneath this surface of military order lay a reality of exhaustion. Supply ships were sunk faster than they could be replaced. Fuel reserves were rationed to the point where tank movements had to be calculated with brutal precision. Replacement troops arrived in smaller numbers with each passing week, many of them scraped from other theaters or conscripted from populations with questionable loyalty to the Nazi cause. The Waffen-SS divisions operating in Italy, once regarded as the cutting edge of German military power, now faced a war of diminishing options. Their commanders understood this mathematics of decline, and this understanding bred a desperation that would shape every decision made in the coming months. General Alfons Hitler, commanding German forces in Italy at this critical juncture, began to advocate for a bold stroke. Rather than continue the grinding defensive posture that was slowly bleeding away German strength, he proposed a major counteroffensive designed to retake lost ground, relieve the pressure on the Winter Line, and demonstrate to Hitler's leadership that Germany retained the capacity for offensive action. The plan carried the unmistakable scent of wishful thinking, yet it reflected a desperate logic. If Germany could not attack and win, then surely Germany could only defend and lose. The alternative to offensive action was slow strangulation, and slow strangulation was a sentence carried out over months or years. A dramatic blow, properly executed, might restore momentum, demoralize the Allies, and buy time for Germany's weapons development programs to produce the miracle weapons that Hitler continued to promise his generals. In April 1944, with spring weather improving conditions for military movement, the decision was made to attack. The 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division and supporting formations were tasked with spearheading the assault in the sector south of Rome. These units, which had been pulled from other sectors to concentrate combat power, represented some of the best equipped and most battle-hardened troops available in Italy. The 16th SS had seen heavy fighting in the withdrawal from southern Italy and understood the capabilities of American and British forces ranged against them. Yet their officers also possessed a kind of audacity born from having survived this long in a war that Germany was slowly losing. The men under their command were a mixture of German SS veterans, Italian fascist volunteers, and conscripted troops from territories under German control. Morale was not what it had been in 1942 or early 1943, but the units retained a professional competence and a stubborn capacity for violence that made them dangerous opponents, regardless of the broader strategic context. As spring turned toward early summer, these formations moved into assembly areas hidden in the hills south of the winter line, preparing to attack northward into terrain they hoped would provide cover and advantage. The offensive commenced on the 17th of May 1944, with German forces attacking across a broad front, designed to overwhelm Allied positions through concentrated firepower and aggressive tactics. The Waffen-SS units moved forward with armor support, seeking to exploit gaps in the Allied line and drive wedges between defending formations. Initial attacks met with some success. German forces pushed back Allied patrols and captured several defensive positions, inflicting casualties on American and British units caught in the path of the assault. The 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division advanced several kilometers in the first 2 days of fighting, and for a brief moment, German commanders allowed themselves to believe that the offensive might succeed. Reports filtered back through the chain of command, suggesting that the Allies were falling back, that their coordination was breaking down, that here at last was the opportunity to regain the initiative. But these reports reflected the fog of battle more than the actual state of affairs. What German intelligence could not see was that the Allies had anticipated the offensive and had positioned substantial reserves specifically to counter it. The Allies, through a combination of signals intelligence and conventional reconnaissance, had detected the concentration of German forces and had prepared their response with characteristic methodical care. General Mark Clark, commanding the American Fifth Army, and his British counterpart, had positioned fresh divisions and artillery concentrations specifically to meet the anticipated German attack. When the Waffen-SS formations pushed forward into what they believed were gaps in the Allied line, they instead found themselves advancing into carefully prepared kill zones, where concentrations of American artillery could rain down fire with lethal accuracy. The Allies had learned, through months of fighting in Italy, that German units could be stopped not through maneuver, but through the application of overwhelming firepower. The spring offensive ran headlong into this firepower wall, and the result was brutal and swift. German assault formations, advancing across open terrain, suffered catastrophic losses to artillery and aircraft. The 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division found its attack stalling within days, as casualties mounted and American reserves arrived to plug any gaps that German forces had managed to create. By the 20th of May, the offensive had fundamentally failed. German forces had advanced perhaps 8 to 10 kilometers at its deepest penetration, but they had failed to achieve any breakthrough that might have threatened Allied positions or relieved pressure on the winter line. The cost had been extraordinary. German formations reported severe casualties, with some units losing between 30 and 50% of their combat strength in the span of just a few days. The loss of trained officers and non-commissioned officers proved particularly devastating. These men could not be easily replaced, especially as Germany's overall manpower situation deteriorated, with losses mounting on the Russian front and in preparation for the anticipated Allied invasion of France. Panzer and Panzergrenadier elements that had been committed to the offensive returned to their assembly areas, damaged and depleted, their fuel tanks empty, their ammunition expenditures having exceeded resupply. Officers filed reports that were almost uniformly grim. The offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. It had consumed reserves that Germany could not afford to spend, and it had demonstrated that even the best German units in Italy could not overcome the combination of Allied firepower and tactical preparation. What made the failure of the spring offensive even more consequential was its timing. The offensive had been mounted in mid-May, just as the Allies were preparing their final assault on the Winter Line and preparing to break through at the Liri Valley, the low-ground corridor that would allow mechanized forces to advance toward Rome. The German offensive in the south had been intended to disrupt and delay this anticipated breakthrough, to buy time and space through concentrated aggression. Instead, it had stripped German forces of reserves and offensive capability at the precise moment when the Allies were about to apply their decisive blow. The timing, in retrospect, could not have been worse. Just days after German forces abandoned the failed spring offensive, Allied formations attacked along the entire Winter Line with overwhelming force. The Liri Valley breakthrough succeeded, Rome fell, and the German position in central Italy began to unravel with a speed that shocked German commanders, who had only days before been attempting their own offensive. The psychological impact of the failed spring offensive extended beyond the immediate military consequences. German officers and soldiers alike recognized what had occurred. They had attempted to seize the initiative, to demonstrate that Germany retained the capacity for offensive action, and they had been repelled with heavy losses. The message this sent was unmistakable, even if it was rarely expressed in explicit terms. Germany was not recovering from its position of strategic disadvantage. Germany was not finding new reserves of strength and capability. Germany was declining, slowly but inexorably, into a position of permanent strategic inferiority. Morale throughout the Waffen-SS formations in Italy, already strained by months of defensive warfare, and the realization that the home front faced bombing and the eastern front faced catastrophe, sank even further. Men who had entered the war with some expectation of eventual victory now faced the knowledge that they were fighting a war that was effectively already lost. The psychological burden of this knowledge would weigh heavily on every future operation, every defensive position, every withdrawal as the war ground onward through 1944 and into 1945. The strategic consequences of the failed spring offensive rippled through the entire German command structure, in Italy and beyond. General Hitler and the German High Command confronted the reality that Italy could not be sustained as a fortress if Germany lacked the reserves and manpower to counterattack and regain initiative. The only remaining strategic option was a disciplined withdrawal toward terrain that favored defense, a staged retreat that would attempt to inflict maximum casualties on the Allies while preserving German forces for the final defense of German territory itself. Planning began, almost immediately after the offensive failed, for the establishment of the Gothic Line, a new defensive position running across the northern Apennines that German engineers and labor details would construct to serve as Italy's final line of German defense. This represented not a renewed commitment to holding Italy, but rather an acknowledgement of the inevitable loss of the peninsula and an attempt to postpone that loss as long as possible while exacting the maximum cost from the Allies. The failed spring offensive also accelerated a troubling trend in German occupation practices. As German military forces declined in capability and manpower, the Waffen-SS and other German forces increasingly relied upon harsh reprisals, collective punishment, and brutal counterinsurgency tactics to maintain control over occupied territories. The failure to defeat the Allies through military means created a perverse incentive to intensify violence against the civilian population and against partisan forces operating in the German rear. If military victory was no longer possible, then perhaps terror and the demonstration of overwhelming German power could substitute. This logic was never stated explicitly in official documents or in the communications between commanders, but it was evident in the patterns of violence that escalated through late 1944 and into 1945. The Spring Offensive, in failing to achieve its military objectives, inadvertently accelerated the transformation of the Italian occupation from a military enterprise into something darker and more brutal. As German forces withdrew from the failed Spring Offensive and took up positions on the Winter Line once again, the sense of finality was unmistakable. The Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS had attempted their last offensive operation in Italy, had failed despite the commitment of their best remaining units, and now faced an inevitable retreat northward into terrain that promised nothing more than delay. The Italian campaign, which had begun with such confidence when German forces first arrived to stabilize the Mussolini regime, was entering its final phase. The Allies controlled Rome, the path to Florence, and the north lay open, and the only question remaining was how much damage the retreating Germans could inflict before the war finally ended. The Spring Offensive had answered one crucial question. Germany did not possess the strength or the reserves to reverse the course of the war, even in a secondary theater. The mathematics of industrial capacity, manpower, and strategic geography had rendered all such attempts futile. German soldiers and SS men in Italy would spend the remaining months of the war learning to live with that futility, knowing that their best efforts now would merely delay the inevitable, and that courage and sacrifice, however bravely demonstrated, could not alter the fundamental reality of defeat. By the summer of 1944, the arithmetic of Italy's campaign had become brutally clear to German commanders. The Spring Offensive had collapsed, draining the last reserves of Panzer Grenadier strength and mechanized capability. Allied forces, now numbering well over 1 million men across the peninsula, pressed northward with gathering momentum. The Wehrmacht's southern shield, once thought capable of holding the peninsula indefinitely, had cracked. Retreat was no longer a strategic choice, but an operational necessity. What remained was the question of how far and how fast, and whether German forces could extract themselves from Italy without catastrophic loss. The architects of Germany's Italian defense faced an impossible calculation. They possessed neither the manpower for a decisive counter-offensive nor the mobility to abandon the peninsula entirely. The solution, born from desperation and tactical skill, was the establishment of a new defensive position, stretching across the northern Apennines, a chain of mountains forming the spine of central Italy. This became the Gothic Line, a fortified barrier intended to delay Allied progress, while German forces consolidated further north. Its construction had begun months earlier, even as commanders still harbored hopes of offensive success. Now, with those hopes shattered, the Gothic Line transformed from a contingency into the final defensive perimeter south of the Alps. The retreat itself revealed both the competence and the strain within German SS formations. Waffen-SS units did not flee in panic or collapse into disorder. Instead, they conducted disciplined withdrawals, establishing successive defensive positions and fighting sharp rearguard actions to slow the Allied pursuit. These actions required precise coordination between frontline units, holding blocking positions, and reserve elements, preparing the next line of defense. SS officers orchestrated tactical retreats with practiced efficiency, using terrain, artillery concentrations, and mechanized reserves to inflict casualties on advancing American and British forces. The discipline was remarkable given the circumstances. Yet beneath this tactical surface ran an undercurrent of futility that no amount of military skill could mask. Every position held cost men and material. Every withdrawal surrendered more Italian territory to Allied control. Every defensive line bought time measured in days, not weeks. The Gothic Line itself stretched across the most forbidding terrain in the Italian peninsula, running roughly 130 kilometers from the Ligurian coast in the west to the Adriatic in the east. The mountains rose in jagged succession, peaks separated by narrow valleys and river crossings that naturally favored the defender. It was high-altitude warfare in its most brutal form, with combat often occurring above 1,000 meters elevation, where cold, thinness of air, and extreme terrain imposed their own casualties, independent of enemy action. German engineers and Italian fascist labor battalions had fortified the line with concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, wire entanglements, and carefully sited machine gun positions. Supply depots and ammunition caches were positioned in caves and galleries carved into the mountainside. The aim was simple: make every meter of advance so costly that the Allies would exhaust themselves before breaking through. Waffen-SS divisions assigned to defend the Gothic Line included elements of the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division, the 10th SS Panzergrenadier Division, and various independent SS companies and platoons distributed across the front. Many of these formations were under strength, their ranks depleted by casualties from months of continuous combat. Replacements arriving from Germany were often inadequately trained, conscripted from the Volkssturm, or drawn from the Reich's dwindling reserves. The 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division, once a formidable mechanized formation, now operated with severely reduced tank and assault gun strength. Its infantry battalions fought as mountain troops, stripped of most of their mechanized transport and forced to rely on mules and human effort to move supplies through the high passes. Officers noted with grim resignation that the division was becoming less a panzergrenadier formation and more a conventional mountain infantry regiment. Yet they fought with stubborn competence, because the alternative to resistance was annihilation. The retreat north began in earnest in late summer of 1944, as Allied forces broke through German positions in the central Apennines and began pushing toward the Gothic Line. Waffen-SS rearguard units held positions as long as tactically feasible, then withdrew to prepared defensive lines further north, while maintaining contact with pursuing forces. This kind of fighting was grinding and exhausting, offering no rest and no clear end. A battalion would be ordered to hold a position for 48 hours, inflicting maximum casualties on approaching Allies, while preparing defensive positions for the next withdrawal. When the deadline arrived, the unit would fight through the night to disengage, moving northward along narrow mountain roads, while sappers destroyed bridges and laid mines to slow pursuit. Then the cycle repeated. Day after day, night after night, German and SS units contracted northward, still fighting, but always yielding ground. The human cost of these rearguard actions accumulated silently but remorselessly. Men were killed by artillery, by mortar fire, by machine guns, by snipers positioned on higher ground. Others were wounded and had to be evacuated through difficult terrain, placing additional burden on overstretched supply lines. Still others simply collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition, unable to move further uphill with full combat loads. SS medics operated in makeshift field hospitals, established in monasteries, mountain villages, and cave shelters. Amputation was common due to infection and lack of proper surgical supplies. The walking wounded were often patched up and returned to duty because there were no reserves to relieve them. Morale in these units was not destroyed but hollowed out. Men continued fighting because orders were orders, and because the alternative was chaos, but the certainty of eventual defeat was now undeniable. The role of Waffen-SS units in the Gothic Line defense demonstrated a paradox that had come to define German military operations in 1944. The SS formations were among the most reliable and tactically skilled units in the German order of battle, capable of delivering coordinated attacks and conducting orderly retreats under pressure. Yet this very competence meant they absorbed an inordinate share of combat and attrition. They were used repeatedly in the most difficult sectors, faced with the strongest Allied attacks, and required to execute the most complicated tactical maneuvers. This was not because they were expendable. No unit was expendable by 1944, but because commanders had learned through bitter experience that SS units would execute orders with less likelihood of collapse than many Wehrmacht formations. The price was accelerated casualty rates and a steady erosion of unit cohesion. Supply became an increasingly desperate concern as the retreat continued. The Gothic Line defense required ammunition in quantities that German logistical systems could barely provide. Artillery needed shells, infantry needed bullets, anti-tank guns needed armor-piercing rounds. Allied air superiority meant that movement of supplies during daylight was suicidal. Supply convoys operated at night, using blackout procedures and following mountain roads barely wider than mule paths. Drivers navigated by starlight, and breakdowns meant the entire convoy was delayed, creating cascading failures through the supply system. Fuel, always scarce, became almost non-existent as the autumn of 1944 advanced. Some SS Panzer units had to be immobilized because there was insufficient fuel to operate tanks at anything other than emergency combat reserves. Officers reported that their formations were becoming infantry divisions with heavy weapons rather than true mechanized units. Winter approached with terrible certainty as 1944 moved into its final months. The high Apennine peaks began to receive snow in late October and early November. Waffen-SS soldiers, many of whom had never experienced Alpine warfare, suddenly confronted a new and implacable enemy: cold. Trench foot, frostbite, and exposure casualties mounted alongside combat losses. Units issued wool socks and heated shelter when possible, but the Gothic Line's highest positions offered neither. Men developed pathological conditions from constant dampness and cold. Their hands became numb, making rifle operation difficult. Their feet swelled in their boots, making movement painful. The cold sapped energy and mental alertness, making mistakes more likely and reflexes slower. Medical supplies of antibiotics and pain relief were too scarce to treat everyone. Senior medical officers reported that they were essentially triaging soldiers for death, determining who would be treated and who would be left to their fate. The partisan conflict intensified during this period of withdrawal and attrition. As German forces retreated northward, partisan groups operating in the Italian mountains became more active and more confident. Waffen-SS units, tasked with maintaining order in occupied rear areas, found themselves fighting not only against advancing allies, but also against growing resistance networks that attacked supply lines, isolated patrols, and command posts. These partisan operations were not strategically decisive, but they were tactically costly and psychologically wearing. Every supply convoy was at risk. Every communication line could be cut. Soldiers could not move safely except in groups, and even groups faced the danger of ambush. SS commanders responded with increased security sweeps and reprisals against villages suspected of sheltering partisans. This approach contained the partisan threat operationally, but deepened the alienation between occupation forces and the Italian population, turning more Italians toward resistance. By late 1944, the Waffen-SS units defending the Gothic Line had transitioned into a different kind of warfare than they had anticipated. They were no longer the spearhead of German conquest or the instrument of tactical breakthrough. They were now the instrument of delay and attrition, fighting to buy time for Germany's overall defensive strategy, while knowing that time itself was running out. Their tactical competence was never in question. They executed orders with precision and inflicted substantial casualties on attacking forces. But competence at rearguard actions cannot alter fundamental strategic realities. The Allies had more men, more material, more time, and more will to continue fighting. German forces in Italy, including the Waffen-SS, could make each advance costly, but they could not prevent it. The Gothic Line would hold for months, but it would eventually break. The retreat would continue northward toward the Alps and eventual surrender. The only questions remaining were how many more lives would be expended before that moment arrived, and whether German forces could extract themselves intact or would be destroyed in the final catastrophe. The front lines had hardened across the northern Apennines, and with them came a shift in the nature of German occupation across the Italian peninsula. What had once been a mobile campaign, flowing with the currents of battle, now settled into something far more sinister and permanent. The Waffen-SS, no longer racing southward or desperately defending mountain passes, found themselves transformed from frontline assault troops into administrators of terror. Their task was straightforward in concept, but brutal in execution: to control the territory of the Italian Social Republic, eliminate partisan resistance, and maintain German authority over a hostile and increasingly defiant population. This transition from soldier to occupier would define the final 18 months of German presence in Italy and leave scars on the Italian landscape that would outlast the war itself by decades. The apparatus of SS occupation began with intelligence networks that penetrated deep into Italian towns and villages. SS officers established headquarters in commandeered buildings, often requisitioning local government offices and police stations as their operational centers. These installations became the nerve centers of a surveillance state where informants, both German and Italian, fed reports on suspected resistance activity, black market operations, and anti-fascist sentiment. The Waffen-SS recruited from local fascist militias, particularly the brutal National Guard of the Italian Social Republic, creating hybrid security forces that blended German organizational methods with Italian knowledge of local communities. These mixed units proved particularly effective because they combined the SS reputation for ruthlessness with intimate familiarity with the territory and its people. Through informant networks and systematic interrogation, SS intelligence officers built dossiers on hundreds of suspected partisans, their supporters, and their supply chains. The goal was not merely military advantage, but total domination of the civilian sphere through fear and the omnipresent threat of arrest. Interrogation facilities became the true face of SS rule in occupied Italy. Converted monasteries, barracks, and civic buildings transformed into places where captured partisans and suspects disappeared for weeks or months at a time. The SS maintained a deliberate policy of secrecy around these facilities, allowing rumors and whispered accounts to spread through local populations. With devastating psychological effect, prisoners faced isolation, deprivation of sleep, and sustained questioning that blurred the boundary between intelligence gathering and psychological torture. SS interrogators, many of them specialists, transferred from occupied Eastern Europe, applied techniques honed through years of counterinsurgency and terror operations. The information extracted through these methods, much of it unreliable, some of it fabricated under duress, nonetheless fed the SS security apparatus and justified further arrests, creating an expanding cycle of suspicion and violence. Families of arrested individuals were often harassed, their property seized or damaged, their status in communities destroyed. The uncertainty of whether a family member would ever return from interrogation hung over thousands of households like a perpetual shadow. Reprisal operations formed the public face of SS occupation terror and served as the ultimate sanction against partisan activity. When partisans attacked German installations, killed SS personnel, or sabotaged supply lines, SS commanders authorized retaliatory operations against civilian populations suspected of harboring or supporting the resistance. These reprisals followed a systematic logic. For every German soldier killed, a specified number of Italian civilians would be executed, often selected through a combination of random selection and targeted elimination of suspected sympathizers. Villages known or believed to have connections to partisan networks faced the most severe consequences. SS units would sweep through communities, gathering men of military age, conducting brutal interrogations on the spot, and executing those deemed complicit or suspicious. The psychological impact of these reprisals extended far beyond the villages where they occurred, spreading terror throughout occupied territories and compelling many Italians to distance themselves from partisan activity for fear of collective punishment. Photographs of village squares littered with corpses circulated through occupied regions, serving as explicit warnings of the consequences of resistance. The scale of partisan activity that provoked these responses had grown substantially by the latter half of 1944. What had begun as scattered resistance cells and sabotage operations evolved into coordinated military formations capable of controlling territory, disrupting supply lines, and conducting attacks on German installations. Partisan groups emerged across northern Italy with varying ideological commitments: communist formations, nationalist resistance networks, and Catholic-aligned groups operated sometimes in parallel, sometimes in competition, but increasingly in loose coordination against the German occupation. These partisans conducted ambushes along mountain roads where SS supply convoys traveled with diminishing security. They sabotaged railway lines that carried ammunition and fuel northward. They distributed anti-German propaganda, forged documents for refugees and escaped prisoners, and provided shelter and supplies to downed Allied pilots and escaped soldiers. For the SS, this represented a security nightmare, an enemy embedded within the civilian population, invisible until the moment of attack, capable of vanishing back into communities that harbored them. The frustration this generated within SS ranks manifested in increasingly violent and indiscriminate responses. SS officers established their authority through a combination of visible force and administrative control that paralleled the broader fascist state structure of the Italian Social Republic. German military governors coordinated with Italian fascist authorities to impose strict regulations on civilian movement, requisition food and other supplies from local populations, and mandate participation in civil defense organizations. Curfews were strictly enforced, with violators subject to immediate arrest or summary execution. Checkpoints appeared on major roads and at entrances to towns, where SS soldiers or their Italian auxiliaries stopped vehicles and pedestrians, demanding documents and interrogating individuals about their movements and allegiances. Black markets that had flourished in earlier phases of occupation were systematically suppressed, with SS security police conducting raids on locations where forbidden goods were traded. Radios were confiscated or controlled, Listening to BBC broadcasts or other Allied transmissions was declared a capital offence. The occupying SS established a comprehensive system designed to prevent Italians from maintaining any autonomous sphere of life separate from German control and observation. Every aspect of daily existence became politicized, militarized, and subject to potential German scrutiny. The relationship between SS occupation forces and the Italian Social Republic's government remained hierarchical but operationally complex. Mussolini's puppet state provided a veneer of Italian self-governance and legitimacy, yet real authority resided with German military commanders and SS officials who coordinated through German occupation administration. The Italian fascist police and military formations theoretically reported to their Italian commanders, but German officers exercised decisive control over major security operations and final authority over life and death decisions regarding suspects and prisoners. This dual command structure created opportunities for Italian fascist officials to curry favor with their German overlords by demonstrating zeal in suppressing resistance and enforcing occupation policies. Some Italian fascist commanders became notorious for their brutality, using German authority as cover for personal vendettas and profit from occupation. The SS, in turn, viewed Italian fascist forces as useful auxiliaries, but fundamentally unreliable, suspecting that many harbored sympathy for the Italian state and viewing them with a mixture of contempt and pragmatic necessity. German officers often overrode Italian decisions and inserted themselves directly into local administration when they deemed Italian officials insufficiently brutal or reliable. The economic dimensions of SS occupation extended occupation beyond pure military and security concerns into systematic exploitation of occupied territories. Food requisitions intensified as Germany's overall supply situation deteriorated, with SS units conducting sweeps through agricultural regions to seize grain, livestock, and other provisions. Italian farmers were forced to deliver quotas of production to German authorities, often leaving insufficient amounts for local consumption and creating chronic food shortages that affected both partisan recruitment and civilian morale. Forced labor drafts, ostensibly for public works, but often for military fortifications and supply operations, pulled Italian workers from farms and businesses. Deportations of Jews and other groups deemed racially or politically undesirable occurred under SS authority, with Italian Social Republic government officials often providing assistance in identifying victims. The SS security police maintained records of all requisitions, deportations, and forced labor operations, creating an administrative trail that documented the systematic nature of occupation exploitation. This extraction of resources and people represented not merely military necessity, but a deliberate policy of impoverishment designed to subjugate the population and demonstrate the cost of resistance. Personal accounts from both victims and perpetrators reveal the quotidian reality of SS occupation that transcended the strategic level described in military records. Italian civilians spoke in hushed tones of SS officers and soldiers whose cruelty became legendary within specific regions, men whose names alone could instill terror. Former partisans described the constant calculation of risk involved in any resistance activity, knowing that failure meant not merely personal death, but potential retaliation against families and communities. SS officers, in turn, documented their own experiences in letters and reports that reveal the psychological burden of occupying a hostile territory and conducting operations they internally acknowledged crossed ethical boundaries. Some SS men expressed frustration with what they viewed as the futility of their mission, the impossibility of defeating an enemy that appeared to grow stronger as German power declined elsewhere. Others rationalized their actions through ideological frameworks that dehumanized Italians and justified any measures necessary to maintain German control. The human dimension of occupation, the face-to-face interactions between occupiers and occupied, the small acts of mercy and cruelty that defined daily life, created a complex moral landscape far removed from abstract discussions of strategy and doctrine. The material conditions of SS units themselves deteriorated significantly during the occupation phase, even as their control over territory intensified. Supply shortages that plagued the entire German war effort in Italy reached critical levels by 1944 and 1945, affecting SS formations with particular severity because occupation duties could not be abandoned even when frontline units received priority for limited resources. SS soldiers subsisted on reduced rations, wore uniforms increasingly patched and worn, and operated with ammunition supplies that necessitated strict rationing and selective engagement. Equipment replacements became sporadic, forcing units to cannibalize damaged vehicles and weapons to maintain operational capability. The quality of replacements flowing into Italian SS formations declined as Germany's overall manpower situation collapsed, with many reinforcements consisting of conscripts of dubious reliability rather than the ideologically motivated SS volunteers who had fought on previous campaigns. SS officers struggled to maintain discipline and effectiveness within units that were simultaneously stretched thin across occupation duties and insufficient in numbers to secure the vast territories they were tasked to control. The contradiction between expanding occupation responsibilities and shrinking material capacity created stress fractures within SS command structures and contributed to increasingly desperate and indiscriminate security measures. By the final months of 1944, the SS occupation of northern Italy had crystallized into a regime of systematic violence, constrained by ever-dwindling resources and challenged by partisan activity that the occupation machinery could suppress but never eliminate. The transformation from mobile warfare to static occupation had created a situation where SS units bore direct responsibility not only for military security, but for the governance and administration of civilian populations. This role exposed the fundamental limitations of terror as a governing philosophy. Fear could compel compliance and suppress overt resistance, but it could not build genuine loyalty or sustainability. The occupation apparatus, established by the SS, became increasingly dependent on Italian fascist collaborators, local informants, and the fear factor that came from demonstrated willingness to employ ruthless violence. Yet even as these mechanisms of control proliferated and intensified, the broader military and political context that sustained them was collapsing across all fronts. The SS in Italy found themselves trapped between the necessity of maintaining occupation authority in northern Italy and the impossibility of doing so given Germany's overall strategic collapse. This contradiction would reach its breaking point within the following months, as Allied forces prepared their final breakthrough, and as the entire structure of German occupation in Italy began its rapid dissolution toward inevitable defeat. By late autumn of 1944, the Gothic Line had become less a fortress and more a prison. The chain of German defensive positions that stretched across the northern Apennines, from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic, represented the last significant barrier between the Allies and the industrial heartland of northern Italy. For the men of the Waffen-SS divisions holding these heights, it was a world of relentless exposure and diminishing hope. The mountains themselves became both shield and executioner, offering concealment and elevation for defense, yet offering no shelter from the approaching winter and no escape from the closing grip of Allied strength. What began as a strategic necessity in the autumn would transform, by spring, into a grinding war of attrition that depleted German reserves faster than any counteroffensive could hope to replenish them. The physical environment of the Gothic Line defied easy description. High ridgelines, narrow valleys, and mountain passes created a series of natural strongpoints that German engineers had fortified with barbed wire, anti-tank obstacles, and mutually supporting bunker systems. The Waffen-SS units occupying these positions, including elements of the 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division and other formations, were distributed across a front of considerable length, stretched thin and increasingly vulnerable to infiltration. The terrain itself was a character in the drama, steep enough to exhaust men climbing under fire, cold enough to kill the unwary, and remote enough that supply convoys faced hours of hazardous travel on mountain roads, vulnerable to partisan attack and Allied airstrikes. Veterans who had fought in France and Russia found Italy's winter different, not the apocalyptic freeze of the Eastern Front, but a grinding, damp cold that seeped through inadequate uniforms and corroded equipment and morale with equal ruthlessness. As temperatures dropped and first snow fell in late October and early November, the immediate crisis became survival rather than victory. SS divisions reported rising rates of cold injury and respiratory illness. Medical officers recorded cases of trench foot, frostbite, and pneumonia that spread through positions lacking adequate heating, dry clothing, or sufficient food to generate internal warmth. The Army High Command issued orders to maintain combat readiness, but frontline commanders faced a different reality. Men could not fight effectively when their fingers would not bend, and their feet no longer obeyed command. Supply lines stretching back to northern Italy became increasingly congested and vulnerable. Every ton of coal, every blanket, every pair of winter boots had to traverse roads under constant threat from partisan sabotage and Allied bombing. The mathematics were brutal and stark. More supplies went to heating and clothing maintenance. Less remained for ammunition and fuel for vehicles and tanks. German commanders faced a zero-sum calculation where meeting one necessity meant abandoning another. The supply crisis deepened through the winter months with alarming velocity. Unlike the vast logistical apparatus that had sustained German forces during the invasions of Poland and France, the Italian campaign operated under conditions of scarcity that bordered on desperation by 1945. Allied air superiority meant that daylight movement of supplies was increasingly suicidal. Convoys had to move at night, reducing throughput dramatically. The partisan war behind German lines meant that convoy losses to ambush were chronic and unpredictable. Quartermaster reports from SS divisions spoke of ammunition rationing, vehicle fuel restrictions, and food allocations cut to bare subsistence levels. Men on the line received smaller rations than they needed for the physical labor of mountain combat. One consequence was the rise of informal foraging and black market dealings, as soldiers sought to supplement official rations through barter, theft, or negotiation with local populations. This erosion of supply discipline reflected a deeper erosion of command authority and confidence in the war's ultimate direction. Winter also brought a shift in the character of combat operations. Major offensive actions became rare, replaced by constant small unit engagements and patrols aimed at domination of no man's land and disruption of enemy movements. Waffen-SS units conducted aggressive patrol work to maintain an appearance of strength and deny ground to infiltrating Allied reconnaissance teams and partisan groups. These encounters were brief, brutal, and corrosive to morale. Young soldiers, exhausted and cold, engaged in firefights that accomplished nothing measurable except the accumulation of casualties. The Gothic Line did not move significantly in either direction. Yet men died with regularity from November through April. Behind the lines, counterinsurgency operations against partisan forces demanded equal commitment of personnel and violence. SS units tasked with security and occupation duties had to maintain garrisons across scattered towns and villages, mount patrols to suppress resistance activity, and respond to attacks on supply lines and command posts. This division of effort, split between frontline combat and rear area security, meant that no operational zone received sufficient strength for decisive action. The human cost of static warfare in severe conditions proved devastating. Casualty figures from SS divisions grew month by month. Deaths from combat, illness, and exposure, permanent losses to cold injury and disease, psychological breakdowns from the grinding routine of siege conditions. The flow of replacements, which had never been generous, slowed to a trickle by early 1945. SS recruiting efforts had already stripped the pool of German volunteers, and forced conscription was exhausting domestic manpower reserves rapidly. The Eastern Front demanded men and equipment with greater urgency than Italy. Strategic planners in Berlin treated Italy as a secondary theatre, where casualties were acceptable and reinforcements secondary to needs elsewhere. Individual SS unit commanders received reports from division headquarters that no additional personnel replacements could be expected. The logical implication was unmistakable. Holds the line with the men you have, accept casualties as inevitable, and look for victory through some other means than force of strength or numbers. Morale in the winter positions declined, with measurable, documented consistency. Soldiers wrote letters home expressing despair about the war's trajectory, uncertainty about their survival, and frustration at orders to hold ground that increasingly seemed defenseless against eventual Allied breakthrough. Officers reported insubordination and self-inflicted injuries at rates higher than official doctrine deemed acceptable. Some men deliberately sought minor wounds or infections to justify removal from frontline duty. Others simply disappeared into the night, either to desert to Switzerland or to attempt return to German-held territory through the chaos of crumbling command structures. SS discipline remained severe. Desertion remained a capital offense, and some soldiers were in fact court-martialed and executed for attempted escape. Yet the harsh enforcement mechanisms could not overcome the fundamental collapse of purpose. Men obeyed orders because the alternative was immediate death at the hands of their own officers. But obedience divorced from belief in ultimate purpose becomes brittle and unreliable. The material evidence of Germany's overall collapse permeated daily life in the mountain positions. SS soldiers could observe, even in remote alpine heights, the signs of their nation's disintegration. By early 1945, German air power had virtually disappeared from Italian skies. Some soldiers reported seeing a German fighter plane, perhaps once every week or two, a dramatic contrast to the previous years. Conversely, Allied air activity was constant. Reconnaissance flights overhead, fighter bombers striking at targets with impunity, transport planes supplying the Allies with apparent unlimited abundance. The BBC broadcasts, monitored secretly by some soldiers, despite standing orders against such activity, reported Germany's cities being leveled by bombing, Soviet armies advancing into Poland and Hungary, and American and British armies preparing to cross the Rhine. For men isolated in mountain trenches in a foreign country, the sense of disconnection from their homeland was complete. Some learned of family deaths through captured newspapers or whispered conversations. The connection between their sacrifice and the outcomes shaping Europe seemed increasingly irrelevant. By winter 1945, the Gothic Line had become a war of pure attrition, with no possibility of German victory. Unlike previous phases of the campaign, where tactical success or failure had meaningful consequences, The situation in the mountains had calcified into stalemate. Allied forces could not easily break through the elevated terrain. German forces could not counterattack with sufficient strength to push the Allies back. Instead, both sides maintained pressure through constant small operations, harassing fire, and resource consumption. The asymmetry lay in capacity for replacement and resupply. The Allies received regular shipments of ammunition, food, fuel, and personnel replacements through secure supply lines running south through liberated Italy to ports. Germany received nothing. Every round fired, every meal eaten, every man injured or killed meant less capacity to continue the struggle. The mathematics favored exhaustion of the weaker side, which was unmistakably Germany in the Italian theater by early 1945. The partisan war in rear areas intensified as winter progressed and German authority weakened. Resistance movements grew bolder, conducting attacks on supply convoys, assassinating officers and collaborators, and launching local uprisings in certain regions. Waffen-SS units responded with increasingly harsh reprisals, village sweeps, hostage-taking, and execution of suspected partisan supporters. These operations were undertaken not out of military necessity, but out of frustration and rage at the inability to suppress resistance despite overwhelming force and ruthless methods. The cycle of partisan attack and German reprisal created a vicious occupation environment where civilian populations lived in constant fear and German soldiers were forced to commit atrocities that simultaneously hardened their consciences and deepened their sense of personal responsibility for moral crimes. Officers who ordered such operations knew that many men under their command harbored doubts about the righteousness of their actions, yet dissent was impossible and obedience mandatory. The spring thaw of 1945 brought not relief, but acceleration of German collapse. As snow melted and ground hardened, both sides prepared for a final offensive campaign. German command still believed, improbably, that strong defensive positions and tactical skill might achieve some favorable resolution. Allied command, meanwhile, was preparing the assault that would break the Gothic Line and open the Po Valley to rapid advance toward the Alps and Bavaria. Waffen-SS divisions received orders to prepare for intensified combat operations with resources they did not possess. Officers and men knew that they were being positioned not to win, but merely to delay, to buy time for a negotiated peace that would not come, or for some miraculous German strategic reversal that no serious military planner believed possible. The burden of this knowledge, that their struggle was ultimately purposeless, that sacrifice was being demanded for delay rather than victory, weighed more heavily than the physical burden of cold, hunger, and danger. Spring, traditionally a season of renewal and hope, came to the Gothic Line as the season of final reckoning. By April 1945, the Waffen-SS divisions in Italy knew with certainty that their war was ending. Whether that end would come through military defeat, surrender, or fragmentation into chaos remained unclear, but end it would. The winter had extracted its toll. Thousands killed or permanently disabled, equipment worn beyond repair with no hope of replacement, supplies virtually exhausted, and morale eroded to the point where only fear of execution kept men at their posts. The mountain lines that had seemed, in autumn, like a reasonable defensive position, had become a trap. German soldiers were frozen in place, both literally and figuratively, unable to advance, unable to withdraw, able only to endure until endurance itself became impossible. The spring offensive by Allied forces would shatter what remained of German cohesion in Italy, and the remaining weeks of the war would see the collapse not just of military formations, but of the entire apparatus of German occupation and control. By 1944, the arithmetic of war had become brutally simple for the Waffen-SS in Italy. Every casualty was irreplaceable. Every battalion that lost half its strength could not be rebuilt from German reserves. The Reich itself was bleeding on three fronts. Russia consumed men and material with an appetite that dwarfed all other theaters. France demanded constant reinforcement, and the home front faced the prospect of invasion. In Italy, SS commanders faced a choice that was no choice at all: continue the fight with dwindling German manpower, or accept defeat. They chose a third path, one born of desperation and the organizational machinery already constructed across occupied Europe. They would build their units from the conquered, the broken, and the willing. They would turn prisoners into soldiers, deserters into warriors, and ideological enemies into reluctant defenders of the collapsing Reich. This was the SS, at its most cynical and most practical. Willing to arm men it would normally have liquidated if those men could hold a rifle and slow the Allied advance. The foreign contingents that emerged across Italian SS formations between 1944 and 1945 represented not military innovation, but institutional survival, a confession of Germany's demographic defeat, written in the uniforms of 1,000 men who had no real stake in the outcome. The recruitment began quietly, almost invisibly, in prisoner of war camps across the occupied territories. Soviet soldiers, captured by the millions during earlier campaigns, faced a simple proposition presented by German officers and SS recruiters. They could remain in camps where survival was uncertain and conditions deteriorated steadily as German resources shrunk, or they could volunteer for military service in the Waffen-SS. The promise was straightforward: food, shelter, wages, and the possibility of eventually returning home. The reality was far more complex. These men, called Hilfswillige, or voluntary helpers, in the bureaucratic language of the Wehrmacht, had already experienced the full brutality of German captivity. Roughly 3 million Soviet prisoners died in German hands during the war, many from deliberate starvation and exposure. For some, volunteering appeared rational, even if it meant wearing German uniform and fighting former comrades. For others, it was simply a choice between slow death and immediate danger. The SS organized these men into auxiliary units, initially used for labor and security duties, then gradually pushed into combat roles, where they could absorb casualties that would have been unacceptable for German troops. By the time these contingents arrived in Italy, they represented both a military resource and a moral compromise the SS seemed willing to make without hesitation. Among the most notorious of these foreign contingents was the formation, later known as the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division, initially composed largely of Soviet and Eastern European prisoners. These men were transported south to reinforce SS units struggling to maintain strength against the Allied advance. Many had been conscripted into Soviet service before capture and now found themselves pressed into German service under threat and circumstance. Their combat effectiveness varied wildly. Some fought with reasonable competence, motivated by professional military training or simple survival instinct. Others showed little enthusiasm for their role and deserted when opportunity presented itself. The SS response to desertions was characteristic: summary execution, often conducted in front of remaining troops as a deterrent. The message was clear: escape meant death, whether from German bullets or Allied fire. Yet despite these measures, unit cohesion remained problematic. Officers who spoke only German commanded men who understood little beyond basic military vocabulary. Trust between soldiers was minimal. The bonds that normally held military units together, shared nationality, common cause, mutual respect, were largely absent. Instead, these formations held together through fear, necessity, and the simple fact that military structures provide organization in chaos. For men who had survived Soviet captivity, even an uncertain role in a German combat unit held a certain grim logic. The Italian fascists presented a different recruitment problem and a different moral complexity. Following Mussolini's rescue and the establishment of the Italian Social Republic, German command faced the reality of needing Italian manpower to maintain the occupation. The SS was willing to work with Italian fascist militia, the Brigate Nere, and volunteers from the remains of the Italian armed forces. These men were not prisoners, but ideological allies, or at least men who had chosen collaboration over resistance. Yet their integration into SS formations created profound friction. German officers held Italian troops in evident contempt, viewing them as militarily incompetent and ideologically unreliable. Italian soldiers, for their part, resented taking orders from SS officers who treated them as subordinates rather than partners. Language barriers complicated command and control. More fundamentally, Italian fascists fighting alongside SS units understood at some level that their cause was already lost, that German defeat would mean not just military collapse, but personal reckoning. Some fought with dedication regardless, sustained by ideology or fear of what would happen if they failed to demonstrate commitment. Others went through motions of soldiering while mentally preparing for betrayal or surrender. The SS, pragmatic if nothing else, accepted Italian contributions where useful while maintaining German SS personnel in key command positions and combat roles. The logistics of integrating these foreign contingents strained already overburdened supply systems. Each new unit required equipment, and German production could not keep pace with losses and expansion. Weapons were often obsolete or captured from previous enemies. Soviet prisoners were sometimes armed with captured Soviet weapons, creating ammunition nightmares when they operated alongside German troops. Uniforms were mismatched, ranging from original Soviet Red Army dress to improvised combinations of captured gear. Food rations were frequently reduced to stretch supplies further, creating hunger that motivated men toward either greater combat ferocity or desertion depending on circumstances and personality. Medical support was minimal. The Waffen-SS had never prioritized medical care for foreign soldiers, and the Italian campaign's accelerating collapse meant virtually no evacuation or treatment capacity existed for wounded non-German personnel. Officers reported that foreign soldiers soon learned their lives had less value in the system than German lives. A wounded German SS man would be evacuated. A wounded Soviet or Eastern European prisoner would likely be left behind or quietly dispatched. This knowledge shaped behavior and morale in ways that German command seemed not to fully appreciate or care about. Combat effectiveness depended heavily on unit composition and command. Some formations with higher percentages of German cadre and Austrian personnel performed competently. Others, composed almost entirely of foreign conscripts and volunteers, deteriorated into unreliable forces. In several documented instances, foreign contingents simply abandoned positions when pressure became intense, forcing German officers to threaten them with execution or to replace them with German troops. Yet there were counterexamples, foreign units that fought with stubborn determination, holding positions as long as ordered and inflicting casualties on attacking forces. The variation suggests that circumstances mattered more than nationality. Units with experienced officers, clear command structure, and some coherent identity fought better than units where discipline was enforced through terror alone. The SS learned, slowly, that armies composed entirely of coerced soldiers had limits to their effectiveness. At the same time, they had no alternative except to continue the experiment, because the alternative was wholesale German casualties that Germany could not sustain. By 1945, as Germany's overall situation became transparently hopeless, maintaining cohesion in foreign contingents became virtually impossible. Desertion rates climbed. Men increasingly understood that capture by Allied forces offered better prospects than continued service with the SS. German officers responded by increasing draconian measures, executing deserters, executing those suspected of defeatism, sometimes executing entire squads deemed unreliable. These measures produced terror, but not loyalty. Instead, they accelerated further deterioration as men realized they faced execution, whether they fought on or tried to escape. Some foreign soldiers attempted to make separate peace arrangements with Allied commanders, offering intelligence or promising to surrender rather than continue fighting. A few successful negotiations occurred, though documentation is fragmentary. More commonly, foreign soldiers either died in combat, surrendered when opportunity presented, or simply disappeared into the chaos of 1945 as German units fragmented. The employment of Soviet prisoners fighting for Germany created a particularly savage paradox. These men faced a terrible dilemma. If captured by Soviet forces, they would be viewed as traitors, punished, or executed by their own side, yet fighting against their own people. German command understood this trap and sometimes deliberately used Soviet contingents against Soviet or partisan forces, knowing they had no option but to fight fiercely or face annihilation from multiple directions. Some Soviet prisoners did fight with unexpected aggression, motivated by the understanding that survival depended on demonstrating absolute commitment to German victory. Others attempted deliberately to avoid combat or to fight without effectiveness. The psychological toll of this situation was immense. These men were not soldiers with genuine military purpose, but captives forced into impossible circumstances. That they sometimes maintained military effectiveness despite this speaks to human adaptability and survival instinct more than to any particular martial virtue. Italian fascist volunteers presented their own psychological complexity. Men who had volunteered for the Italian Social Republic militia believed they were fighting for a renewed Italian state, a fascist restoration that would rebuild national power and prestige. The reality they encountered in cooperation with the SS was far grimmer: increasing violence, deteriorating military situation, and clear evidence that Germany would not win the war. Some fascist volunteers responded by fighting harder, believing that devotion to the German alliance might somehow reverse outcomes. Others became increasingly cynical, understanding that their sacrifice served no purpose beyond extending the agony of German defeat. Collaboration with the SS against Italian partisans created particularly intense moral confusion. These men were fighting fellow Italians, sometimes neighbors or former comrades, on behalf of German occupation. The partisan operations intensified throughout 1944, making every patrol and supply run a potential death trap. Italian fascist volunteers began to understand that their German allies valued them as cannon fodder, used in the most dangerous operations where German personnel were withheld. This knowledge poisoned relationships and reduced morale further. The desertion epidemic among foreign contingents reflected the fundamental impossibility of the situation. Men without genuine stake in German victory began to understand that the rational choice was to stop fighting and accept capture. Some managed successful desertions, melting into the Italian countryside and hoping to survive the remainder of the war as civilians or partisan sympathizers. Others were captured attempting to desert and executed as examples. The most tragic cases were men who successfully deserted from German service, were captured by partisan forces, and then faced execution as German collaborators. The situation created a deadly three-way struggle, where foreign soldiers of dubious loyalty found themselves targets from all directions simultaneously. By the spring of 1945, the foreign contingents in Italian SS formations had become almost entirely unreliable from German perspective. Units were kept in rear areas where they could be easily controlled, brought forward only when attrition in frontline formations made their losses acceptable. German officers began stockpiling these foreign soldiers in fortress positions where escape would be difficult and surrender unlikely, sacrificing them in situations where German personnel were spared. The SS had essentially abandoned the pretense that foreign volunteers were anything other than cannon fodder, conscripted cannon fodder, stripped of citizenship, dignity, and genuine choice. Some formations maintained higher discipline and motivation until the very end. Most deteriorated into confused aggregations of desperate men waiting for the war to end, hoping to survive until Allied liberation or Soviet advance made further German service impossible. The foreign contingents represented the SS at its most nakedly desperate, unable to field armies from German manpower alone, forced to arm the conquered and conscript the desperate, maintaining them through fear while their own cause crumbled toward inevitable collapse. As the war's final months approached, these foreign soldiers faced impossible choices. Surrender to the Allies offered reasonable prospects of survival and eventual repatriation. Surrender to the Soviets meant potential execution as traitors. Continued service meant fighting on behalf of a cause everyone knew was lost. Escape into the Italian hills meant death by starvation or capture by partisans. German command offered no guidance through this moral maze. Orders were simply to fight and hold positions until told otherwise. For thousands of foreign soldiers integrated into Italian Waffen-SS formations, the solution was inaction and drift, waiting for events to decide their fate rather than actively choosing. When the end came in May 1945, many foreign soldiers surrendered peacefully to advancing Allied forces, sometimes removing German insignia and claiming they had been forced into service. Some narrative truth existed in these claims. Others attempted to rejoin Soviet forces or Italian partisan units and were received with varying degrees of forgiveness or suspicion. A significant minority remained in German service until the very last moment, either from discipline, from inability to find opportunity to escape, or from simple psychological paralysis. The foreign contingents never fundamentally solved the manpower crisis that animated their creation. What they did accomplish was extend the duration and intensity of the occupation, buy time with conscripted blood, and ensure that the final collapse involved not just Germans, but thousands of foreign men whose choices had been made for them by circumstances and compulsion. By 1944, the occupation of Italy had begun to consume itself. The Waffen-SS units stationed throughout the peninsula found themselves trapped between two enemies, the Allies advancing from the south and a growing phantom army emerging from the mountains and cities of the north. The partisan movement, which had started as scattered bands of deserters and anti-fascist resistors, had evolved into a coordinated insurgency capable of striking anywhere, at any time. What had begun as isolated acts of sabotage had matured into systematic warfare, conducted not with tanks or artillery, but with dynamite, small arms, and an intimate knowledge of terrain that no German map could capture. By the time winter descended on 1944, the partisan war had become the occupation's defining reality, a conflict fought in shadows and silence, where victory could not be measured in miles gained or territory held, but only in bodies counted and fear instilled. The partisan networks operated with remarkable sophistication, despite their ragged appearance and limited resources. In the industrial cities of Milan and Turin, communist and socialist cells coordinated with monarchist groups and Catholic activists to create intelligence networks that tracked German movements with startling accuracy. Mountain strongholds in the Piedmont and the Eastern Alps served as training grounds and supply depots, places where partisan bands grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands, as deserters from the Italian Social Republic Army and young men fleeing conscription joined the resistance. Supply trains moving north toward the Gothic Line became targets of opportunity, ambushed on narrow mountain roads where partisan fighters could strike and vanish before German reinforcements arrived. Partisan couriers and radio operators maintained contact with Allied intelligence services in Switzerland, receiving information about German unit dispositions and weapons shipments that allowed them to concentrate their efforts where they could do the most damage. The Germans had underestimated them initially, viewing the partisans as bandits and criminals rather than soldiers. But by mid-1944, German commanders recognized that they faced a genuine military threat operating within their occupation zone. The escalation of partisan activity in 1944 coincided with a critical shift in Italian public sentiment. As the Allies pushed northward and the promise of liberation became visible on the horizon, ordinary Italians increasingly viewed the partisans as liberators rather than outlaws. Villages that had been hostile or neutral began providing food, shelter, and intelligence to partisan bands. This shift in civilian support transformed the partisan war from a marginal nuisance into a fundamental threat to German control. Factory workers conducted strikes and slowdowns to sabotage armaments production. Railwaymen delayed trains carrying supplies to the front. Peasants hid deserters and provided warnings when German patrols approached. The occupation regime, which had relied on a facade of collaboration and forced compliance, suddenly faced the reality that large segments of the Italian population had turned against it. German and SS commanders understood that this was not merely a military problem that could be solved through tactical maneuver. It was a political failure that could only be addressed through force. The Waffen-SS response was swift and brutal. Already notorious for their ruthlessness on other fronts, SS units in Italy conducted reprisal operations designed to terrorize the civilian population into abandoning the partisans. When partisan attacks killed German soldiers or damaged supply lines, SS units would sweep through the surrounding villages, arresting suspects, conducting summary executions, and burning homes. These reprisals followed no rational calculation of guilt or innocence. The logic was purely one of terror. Make the cost of supporting the partisans so high that no civilian would dare provide shelter or supplies to resistance fighters. SS units under the command of various division and brigade leaders became known throughout northern Italy for the ferocity of their reprisal campaigns. Entire villages were destroyed, their populations massacred, to send a message to other communities that collaboration with the partisans would result in annihilation. These operations were not sanctioned by formal military orders in most cases, but rather emerged organically from the culture of violence that characterized the Waffen-SS and the desperation of commanders facing a war they could not win through conventional means. The mechanics of the reprisal cycle became grimly systematic. A partisan attack would occur, targeting a supply convoy or killing SS personnel in an ambush. German intelligence, often based on torture, denunciation, or simple proximity to the attack site, would identify villages suspected of harboring partisan sympathizers. SS units would cordon off the area, preventing escape, and then conduct house-to-house searches, often accompanied by deliberate destruction of property. Men of military age were separated from their families, interrogated under torture, and frequently executed on suspicion of partisan activity. Women and children were sometimes killed alongside the men. Sometimes they were left alive to witness and remember. The scale of these reprisal operations escalated as 1944 progressed and partisan activity intensified. In some regions, entire communities were liquidated. The German military tradition, which had emphasized a distinction between soldiers and civilians, had collapsed entirely in the occupation zones. The Waffen-SS and other German occupation units operated with the understanding that in a war against an insurgency, such distinctions were luxuries that could not be afforded. Partisan operations, in turn, became increasingly bold and lethal in response to German brutality. Rather than confining themselves to supply line sabotage and information gathering, partisan units began conducting direct attacks on German positions, small-scale military operations designed to demonstrate that they could stand and fight. Partisan bands would ambush German patrols, attack isolated command posts, and conduct raids on weapons depots. They assassinated German and Italian fascist officials, targeted collaboration with precision that suggested sophisticated intelligence gathering. Each partisan attack, however, triggered the cycle of reprisal, and with each reprisal, more Italians were driven toward active resistance rather than passive accommodation. The occupation regime was caught in a vicious spiral where its response to the insurgency created the conditions that generated more insurgency. German commanders complained bitterly in reports to their superiors that fighting the partisans was like trying to hold water in your hands. The harder you squeezed, the faster it ran through your fingers. Yet squeezing harder was the only response the SS commanders understood. The scale of violence in occupied northern Italy by late 1944 exceeded what most soldiers had anticipated when they first arrived on the peninsula. What had begun as a police action against bandits had evolved into a savage occupation war in which the distinction between frontline combat and occupation violence had completely dissolved. SS divisions assigned to occupation duties found themselves fighting for survival against an enemy that was simultaneously civilian and military, that operated within the communities they were supposed to control, and that could neither be negotiated with nor decisively defeated through military means. The psychological toll on both German forces and Italian civilians was immense. German soldiers lived with the constant awareness that they could be killed by someone they had passed on the street that morning, by a child or an elderly person, by anyone. Italians lived with the terror of German reprisals, knowing that their village could be destroyed if a partisan cell operated nearby, regardless of whether they themselves had any connection to the resistance. The winter of 1944 to 1945 brought no relief to this cycle of violence. If anything, the season exacerbated the brutality by making movement more difficult, by increasing scarcity, and by confining soldiers and partisans to smaller areas for longer periods. Snow in the mountains and rain in the valleys made supply movements hazardous and predictable, creating opportunities for partisan ambush. The cold killed soldiers who were wounded or trapped, adding a dimension of suffering beyond the immediate violence of combat. German units, knowing that partisan activity increased in the spring when roads became passable and movement easier, attempted to crush the resistance networks during the winter months through the most ruthless means available. These winter campaigns produced some of the highest casualty figures and the most notorious incidents of occupation violence. Villages in areas suspected of harboring partisan strongholds were surrounded and their populations systematically killed. Mass graves were dug, sometimes hastily, sometimes with bureaucratic precision that reflected the administrative nature of these killings. Yet the partisans persisted and in many cases grew stronger despite the German onslaught. The harsh German response had the paradoxical effect of increasing partisan recruitment and support rather than suppressing it. Young men who might have remained neutral saw their families destroyed by German reprisals and joined the resistance. Communities that might have cooperated with occupation authorities lost all reason to do so after experiencing German brutality. By early 1945, partisan bands in some regions of northern Italy numbered in the thousands, and they controlled territory during daylight hours in areas far from German garrisons. The SS units tasked with suppressing them were exhausted, under strength, and increasingly demoralized. Officers reported that they lacked the manpower to maintain control of the territory assigned to them while simultaneously fighting the Allies on the Gothic Line. The occupation regime had become unsustainable even before the military situation on the main front began to collapse. The moral and strategic bankruptcy of the reprisal strategy became apparent to some German commanders by early 1945, though few dared voice such doubts openly. The violence had failed to eliminate the partisan threat, had failed to terrorize the population into compliance, and had instead created a night situation where large regions of northern Italy were effectively contested between German and partisan control. Military officers with traditional training and background sometimes clashed with SS commanders over reprisal policy, arguing that such operations were counterproductive and violated accepted norms of military conduct. These objections rarely carried weight. The Waffen-SS answered to SS hierarchy and to Nazi Party directives that viewed the entire Italian conflict through the lens of ideological struggle rather than conventional military strategy. The partisans were not soldiers to be defeated, but subhumans to be exterminated, enemies in a racial and political war that transcended the rules of warfare. This ideological framework allowed SS commanders to wage unlimited war against the partisan movement, without the restraint that might have been imposed by military law or the Geneva Conventions. The partisan war in occupied Italy thus became a window into the nature of Nazi occupation and the Waffen-SS's role in enforcing it. The organization that had been introduced to the Italian peninsula as an elite fighting force, tasked with military defense of German interests, had instead become an instrument of occupation terror, conducting reprisals against civilians and participating in mass killings that had no military justification. The partisan struggle, however fierce and committed, could not defeat the Germans militarily, but it could, and did, prevent the occupation from ever achieving the stability and legitimacy that might have allowed Germany to hold Italy long-term. By 1945, the German occupation of northern Italy existed in a state of constant, exhausting violence, from which there was no exit short of military defeat. The cycle of partisan attack and German reprisal would continue until Allied armies broke through the Gothic Line and liberated the peninsula. Only then could the violence finally end, though the scars it had carved into Italian society would require decades to heal. By the winter of 1944, the Waffen-SS divisions defending Italy knew a truth that Berlin was no longer willing to acknowledge. Germany was dying. Not slowly, not strategically, but with the velocity of a collapsing regime. The Red Army was closing in from the east at terrifying speed, having shattered Army Group Center and driven toward the Vistula. In the west, American and British forces had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were pouring across the Rhine. The Third Reich, once the master of continental Europe, was now fighting for its life on two fronts, with dwindling resources and no possibility of victory. In Italy, the Waffen-SS faced a different kind of reckoning. There were no grand counter-offensives waiting, no secret weapons, no miraculous reserves. There was only the slow recognition that occupation had become a caretaker mission, that holding the Gothic Line was no longer the prelude to German triumph, but merely the postponement of inevitable defeat. The men wearing the SS runes understood this. Some accepted it with grim professionalism, others clung to fanaticism. All of them faced a choice that would define their final months alive. The strategic situation in Italy during early 1945 was one of protracted stalemate, masking rapid decay. The Gothic Line, that network of fortifications stretching across the Apennine Mountains from coast to coast, remained intact, but increasingly hollow. Allied forces under General Mark Clark possessed overwhelming advantages in manpower, air support, and supplies. German divisions counted their strength not in battalions, but in the fragments of battalions. The 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, which had arrived in Italy as a coherent fighting force just months earlier, was now reduced to perhaps 40% of its authorized strength. Similar stories played out across every German and SS formation in the theater. Replacements were not coming. The training pipeline had collapsed. The drafts that fed the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS were now being diverted to the Eastern Front and to the defense of German soil itself. Supply lines, always precarious in Italy, were now barely functional. American fighter bombers controlled the skies above every road and rail line. Trucks carrying ammunition, fuel, and food were being ambushed, strafed, and destroyed at alarming rates. The Waffen-SS in Italy was being starved into defeat. Command structures, always taught with hierarchy and ideological intensity, began to splinter under these pressures. German general officers in Italy received contradictory orders from multiple superiors. Berlin insisted that every position must be held to the last man and the last round, a suicidal mandate rooted in Hitler's refusal to countenance retreat. Field commanders on the ground could see clearly that such orders led only to the destruction of their remaining forces. Some commanders, shaped by professional military tradition and a soldier's responsibility to preserve his men, began to interpret these orders creatively. They would conduct strategic withdrawals while claiming they were implementing operational concepts demanded by higher authority. Others, the true believers, attempted to follow Hitler's orders precisely, leading their men into battles that were lost before they began. The SS, with its deep commitment to Nazi ideology and its traditions of obedience, contained both types. Some SS officers were pragmatists who would survive the war and later deny any knowledge of the regime's crimes. Others were fanatics who would fight to the death for a corpse of an empire. The Italian campaign's final year became, in many ways, a contest between these two impulses, playing out within the same military organizations. The condition of the troops themselves reflected the wider collapse. Men who had been conscripted into the Waffen-SS in 1944 now found themselves in 1945 as survivors of battles they never wanted to fight. Their uniforms were threadbare, patched with whatever material could be salvaged. Boots were worn through. The famous SS discipline, once enforced by zealous officers and the omnipresent threat of execution, was breaking down. Desertion increased. Some men, particularly those from conquered territories who had been pressed into German service, simply disappeared into the chaos of the disintegrating front. Others abandoned their units and attempted to return to their homes, hoping to survive the war's final weeks in obscurity. German officers responded with increasingly harsh punishments. Courts-martial accelerated. Men were executed for cowardice